Chapter 43. After he finished eating and drinking, he rested for a while. Then, he leisurely walked to the first deployment spot. He was not in a hurry because he knew that the white sandworms were slow at following the scent. He had spent a long time in the cave, but he only managed to attract 3 of them. And that was when they were dozens of miles deep into the Gobi Desert. They had only entered less than 10 miles into the Gobi Desert, so how many of them could come? To be honest, he had a mental limit of not being able to catch even one. He would just have to go deeper next time. However, when he reached the first spot and looked down from the top of the pit, he was shocked. The porcelain bottle was completely covered with white sandworms. There were at least 100 of them. How long had it been? How did he attract so many of them? He did not have time to think about the reason. He quickly picked up the rope next to him and put the lid on the porcelain bottle. He did not know what was happening inside, but the white sandworms crawling all over the wall reacted quickly when they sensed danger. They burrowed into the sand and disappeared in an instant, leaving only a clean bottle behind. Lu Xiaoyi felt a little numb. To be honest, after seeing the worms crawling over the porcelain bottle, he did not want to go down and move the bottle. What if one of them accidentally escaped from the bottle and ran out? What if the large group of worms hiding in the sand saw someone coming down and swarmed over? Lu Xiaoyi was a little scared when he imagined himself covered in worms. To be honest, whether it was in his previous life or in this life, he was not a brave person. He was just pretending to be brave. He was not scared of blood and had trypophobia. Who knew what would happen in the future? Fortunately, his savior arrived soon enough. Looking at Ping'an, who was following him, Lu Xiaoyi was very kind and firm. "Ping'an, go down and bring the bottle up." Ping'an wanted to cry but had no tears. Of course, he knew that his little master must be catching something strange. Was it a sand snake? Or a sand scorpion? Sand spider? He did not know. The only thing he knew was that it must be something disgusting. It was hiding in the bottle and crawling around. His little master kindly passed him 2 clips. "Clamp the lid tightly." "Okay, don't peek." Ping'an had no choice. Who asked him to eat the rice of Lu province? He jumped into the pit with fear and trepidation. Then, he carefully clamped the lid of the porcelain bottle with a pair of tongs. Then, he climbed out with Lu Xi's help. After that, he carefully wrapped a piece of cloth around the seams. Lu Xiaoyi was afraid that the insects inside would escape, but Ping'an's heart was pounding. He didn't know what kind of monster was inside. After Ping'an loaded the bottle onto the horse's back, he continued to close the second bottle cap. He did the same thing, but from beginning to end, Ping'an did not see what was inside. On the way back, Lu Xiaoyi was in high spirits, humming an unknown tune. No matter who he met, he would greet them cordially. Ping'an was the exact opposite. It was not because of anything else, but because there were 2 bottles hanging behind his horse's buttocks. He always felt that something was biting his buttocks. After walking a few steps, he would look back, walk again, look again. He was already seriously considering the possibility of continuing to work in Lu province. The problem was, once he'd boarded his little master's pirate ship, it would not be easy to get off. "Young master, I think it's not appropriate for you to bring these 2 bottles back to the residence. If something escapes, will anyone still live in the residence? Or, it could be harmful to the old madam." Lu Xiaoyi glanced at him. "Don't use my mother to pressure me. I know what's right and what's wrong. I'm not playing around. You have to understand that. We'll go in through the side door and go directly to my study. Don't let anyone see." They were quite lucky. The 2 old ladies had not returned yet. If they knew that the result of this incense offering was that the brat had gone to the Gobi Desert again, what would they think? Ping'an escaped from his little master's courtyard. He was afraid that his little master, who was getting more and more out of control, would force him to open the bottle. Just thinking about what might crawl out of the bottle gave him goosebumps all over his body. Ordinary people who had not undergone special training would not be able to accept such a scene. He was wrong. Lu Xiaoyi really did not use anyone else to complete the final procedure. That was because he did not have a plan to mature them. Initially, he wanted to catch a few to study their habits, and see if he could come up with a better solution. Who knew that he would be able to find hundreds of white sandworms in 2 bottles in such a short time? If the bottles were left open for another half a day, he was sure that there would be thousands of white sandworms in each bottle. He also understood why the plan went so smoothly. It went so smoothly that he dared not imagine it. That was because when he was trapped in the cave, the puffer string incense was mixed with the lamp oil. Most of it had been diluted, and most of it had been burned. That was why the incense was not strong enough. This time, it was very different. This was the purest puffer string incense without any impurities. Also, because he did not know the amount, he poured a little too much. A total of 10 taels of silver was poured into the sand pit. If there was a next time, he would definitely not do this. He would pour less or dilute it with other liquids. The white sandworms were caught too easily, and Lu Xiaoyi's rhythm was disrupted. He originally wanted to study and experiment at the same time. For example, how could he extract the spiritual energy from the white sandworms and use it on himself? He could not possibly eat them, right? Eat them raw? Yes, he could definitely retain the spiritual energy, but that was too disgusting. He could not swallow them raw because he was worried that those little things would turn his stomach upside down. However, if he wanted to chew them in his mouth and circulate his qi, even if he was an old soul who had experienced time travel, he could not do it. Eat them cooked? Should he steam or boil them? Should he fry them? Should he add oil, salt, soy sauce, and vinegar? Or stir-fry them with shredded pork? Should he add garlic? Most importantly, he felt that if he ate them cooked, he would not be able to retain the spiritual energy. That would be meaningless. In the summary of Mount Zhong's cultivation, there was an introduction to the different types of spiritual energy that humans could absorb. The best type was the spiritual vigor that flowed naturally between heaven and earth. As there were no impurities and no attributes, it was very suitable for everyone. The second type was spiritual objects. As spiritual objects were man-made, they had their own direction and preferences. Once you absorbed it, you would automatically inherit the teachings of the person who created the spiritual object. In the future, you would have no choice but to follow this path. You would have no choice but to walk down this path. Lastly, there were spiritual vigor lifeforms, including animals and plants. These lifeforms also had their own attributes. For example, the precious fire rattan wood had the fire attribute, and the coldly grass had the water attribute. As for animals, needless to say, the higher the level of the animal, the more unique the spiritual vigor attribute it had. Unless you wanted to become a monster, no one would absorb the spiritual energy of a monster. However, in this theoretical system, there were some exceptions. For example, among the animal species, those low-level monsters that did not have spiritual intelligence, and only relied on their instincts to collect spiritual vigor. They could not even be considered monsters, but the spiritual energy in their bodies was the purest and had not been modified. These little creatures included the white sandworms. Chapter 44. This was one of the main reasons why Lu Shui had his eyes on the white sandworm. Other than the fact that the individual's spiritual opportunity was extremely weak, everything else was perfect. Since it did not have any intelligence, the spiritual opportunity was just a primitive life form. What Lu Xiaoyi needed to do next was to find a way to transfer this pitiful amount of spiritual opportunity to himself. Since the individual white sandworm was too weak, he had to find a way to graft them in batches. If he did it one by one, he would die of exhaustion sooner or later. There was a lot of preparation work to be done. Most of the porcelain bottles were to be used to distribute the spiritual energy. Otherwise, if he opened them abruptly, these things would scatter and burrow into the ground. If that happened, Lu Province would really be uninhabitable. How would he explain that to his mother? It would be best if he could find a completely enclosed space that would not allow the white sandworm to escape. However, this was difficult to do. These little worms had an extremely strong ability to burrow into the ground. Wooden and mud walls would not be able to stop them at all. Unless he used porcelain to build a room, this was impossible. With a serious scientific attitude, he decided to study the white sandworm's living habits first. Most importantly, what did the barb on its tail look like? Did it hurt when it stung? Were there any side effects? He wanted to find someone to test this out, but after thinking about it, he decided that it would be best for him to test it out himself. Everyone's tolerance was different. If he wanted to cultivate, he would have to pay a certain price. If he had to choose between living for a few more decades and feeling some pain, it was worth it. He moved a porcelain bottle, then an empty one. He wanted to transfer a few of them over. These things could not fly, so it would not be fast for them to crawl in the porcelain bottle. As long as he moved quickly, the white sandworm's escape would not happen again. He was still a little nervous. After all, in his previous life, there had been tragedies of people being stung to death by a small hornet colony. He would not be that unlucky, right? This was how unpredictable a person's cultivation was. If there was another person around, at least they could save him before he fainted. He gritted his teeth and reminded himself that there was no success in this world without taking risks. His right hand was trembling. He did not know if it was because the empty porcelain bottle was too heavy or because he was nervous. His left hand gently and slowly moved the lid of the porcelain bottle that contained the white sandworm. After waiting for a while, he felt that with the size of the white sandworm and its flexible body, it should be able to crawl out. He was a little regretful that he had poured too much of the tough string incense. Were these things ignorant of life and death, gathering together to chew on the tough string incense? He waited for a while, but since they did not come out, he instinctively pushed the cap open a little more. Then, more than 10 white sandworms jumped out with incredible agility. That's right, it's hopping. Perhaps it's not too accurate because they don't have legs. When they hop, they bend their bodies like a spring. Lu Xiaoyi's mistake was that the book described these creatures as having no intelligence. He was misled. It was true that they had no intelligence, but they had their instincts. He had the instinct to yearn for the free air. Under the control of this instinct, it was normal for more than 10 white sandworms to jump out. In fact, what he did not see was that there were more white sandworms jumping out from the porcelain bottle. However, because the opening was too small, most of them bounced back after hitting the porcelain bottle cap. Only these 10 white sandworms that were the luckiest managed to jump out from the gap between the bottle cap and the opening of the bottle. This was Lu Xiaoyi's mistake. It came from his lack of understanding of the creatures that he was unfamiliar with. However, as a person, or rather as a soul, he was not brave, but his reaction was very fast. It was also a kind of instinct. He did not scream, he did not push the porcelain bottle away in a panic, and he did not retreat recklessly. He made the right choice subconsciously, and his left hand immediately repositioned the porcelain bottle cap. This prevented an even greater tragedy from happening. The study room was crawling with white sandworms, but he was punished for his choice. Because he did not dodge in time, more than 10 white sandworms jumped out and started to bend their bodies for the second time. This was a purposeful jump, and it was still driven by their instincts. When they realized that there was great danger, their only countermeasure was to stab the barbs on their tails. They would stab the intruder's body. Facing the white sandworms that were less than an inch long and jump like little marbles, Lu Xiaoyi did not have much fighting experience, and did not have much experience in dealing with them. Everything happened so suddenly that he could not dodge even one of them. On his face, neck, chest, arms, legs, the white sandworms cooperated very well. They attacked instantly, and there was no blind spot. Have you ever imagined being stung by more than 10 wasps at the same time? Lu Xiaoyi was experiencing it now. If he was stung once, a human would scream. If he was stung twice, he would probably scream in pain. When more than 10 wasps of extreme pain hit him at the same time, other than sucking in cold breaths from the pain, he could not even scream. It was as if there was no part of his body that did not hurt. There were thousands of places where he was stung, and he did not even know where he was stung. His body was stiff, and he could not make any normal movements. He could only maintain his posture and slowly sit down. This was a natural phenomenon when a normal person came into contact with Spiritium for the first time. There was no one to protect him, help him, or guide him. Thousands of thoughts flashed through his mind at the same time, but Lu Xiaoyi accurately grasped the most important one. He did not regret, feel sad, remember, or think about his last words. He sat on the ground and closed his eyes. No, he could no longer control his eyelids. Middle parallel chi formula. This was a disaster, but it was also an opportunity. It was no longer important how he reached this step. What was important was what he should do when he reached this step. If Ping'an barged in at this moment, he would definitely not recognize his young master because he was already swollen like a rubber ball. But of course, he would not appear. With those strange things around, he would not enter even if he was beaten to death. This was Lu Xiaoyi's own doing. In order to protect his shameful privacy, the only requirement he had for his servants in the past few months since he had transmigrated was that no one was allowed to barge in without his permission. The white sandworms that shot out their stingers were not much better than Lu Xiaoyi. All the essence in their bodies had been turned into stingers that were nailed into their opponents' bodies. They had become real worms, and they could not even move like normal worms. In the Gobi Desert, this was the most dangerous state they could be in. They would either stab their opponents or become delicious food for the sand snakes, scorpions, and spiders. They could only wait for a period of time and slowly recover their strength. Only then would they be able to drill into the depths of the sandy soil. Then they could rely on their instincts to find insignificant and meaningless spirit veins under the Gobi Desert. Over a long period of time, they would replenish themselves until they could cultivate another barb. Just like that, humans and worms perished together. They slowly recovered in silence. No one knew who would have the last laugh. There was a commotion in the front yard. That was the return of the two madams. After a period of commotion, it returned to silence. They were old and tired after a day's work. Of course, they needed to rest early. No one came to care about the life and death of a certain unlucky person. Chapter 45. In the morning, when the first ray of sunlight shone through the window and landed on Lu Xiaoyi's face, he woke up as if he could feel the warmth. He shook his sleeves and patted his body. Everything was normal. It was as if nothing had happened and he had only had a realistic nightmare last night. He was not as strong as an ox, as light as a swallow, as strong as a drum, and he was not covered in mud. Even a dying person would not be able to excrete more than a few kilograms of black mud, right? As he complained out of habit, he stood up and looked around. Those real existences told him clearly that everything had happened. The porcelain bottle was still in its original position. The dozen or so half-dead worms on the ground all told him that it was not a dream. He narrowed his eyes. The morning sunlight and the rising dust in the room intertwined to form a beautiful picture. In this picture there were faint flashes of golden light, like mischievous fairies. This was not an illusion caused by banging his head against the wall and seeing stars. This was also something real. This thing had a very desirable name, spiritual opportunity of the heavens and earth. This was cultivation. Naturally, it was not like reaching the heavens in a single step. As he walked further down this path, this spiritual opportunity would eventually be used by him. It would turn into fire, roast duck with wine. It would turn into ice, sour plum soup on a hot summer's day. Wasn't this a little too useless? He did not care. This process was wonderful and enjoyable. There was no need to suppress himself with these heavy and lofty ideals. He stood there quietly, once again circulating the parallel chi art. The floating golden motes of light in the air slowly and unwillingly surged towards him. This was the true essence of cultivation, the source of all magic, the beginning of another world. This was what he deserved. He stopped daydreaming. He realized that he was not as excited as he thought he would be. It was as if all of this was logical and natural. He crouched down and carefully picked up the dozen or so white sandworms and placed them back into the empty porcelain bottle. He did not have the magnanimity to cherish moths and sand, nor did he have the ideals of equality for all races. Since they were still alive, there was no need to stomp them to death and sweep the floor. He could just put them back the next time he went to the Gobi Desert to catch worms. After taking the first step in cultivation, the biggest feeling he had was, he exited the study and turned left. Behind the corridor, there was a small bamboo forest. There was a small room under red bricks and green tiles. He released himself to his heart's content. After holding it in for a long time, he felt like he was going to explode. Cultivators were also hungry and needed to eat. Cultivators also had a cycle that needed to be expelled. Why was it that other people's cultivation was so high and mighty, but when it came to him, it was just oil, salt, soy sauce, vinegar, and tea? "Chanhua, bring me some breakfast. I'm hungry. Take a few more buns. I want mince meat," Lu Xiaoyi shouted towards the outside. Then, the sound of a young maid running towards the kitchen could be heard. After washing up and finishing his breakfast, Lu Xiaoyi went to pay his respects to his mother as usual. It wasn't a big deal, so he chatted for a bit before returning to his study. In any case, this was the first step. It would be a lie to say that he was not happy. His heart was very eager. He needed to go through everything that had happened last night so that he could determine the next step of the plan. Life required planning, especially the life of cultivation. He noticed that there were no traces of the white sandworm's barbed tail on his body. At that time, he knew very well that his hands and face had been stung. No matter how powerful the medium parallel chi formula was, it was impossible for it to absorb all the hardened barbs, right? He first circulated the medium parallel chi formula a few times, but he felt that the results were very small. It was as though he had made no progress. On one hand, it was because the spiritual opportunity was thin. On the other hand, it was because the timing was wrong. In this world, the effects of cultivation were different at different times. The best timing was between dawn and dusk. Simply put, it was the time when the sun rose and set. This was because the spiritual opportunity was the most active at that time, and it was also the most intimate. It would result in twice the result with half the effort. Of course, if you spent all 24 hours cultivating, no one would bother you. It was just that the efficiency was too low. This referred to the consumption of spiritual opportunity by nature. If one relied on spiritual tools and spiritual items, there would not be so many rules. This included these white sandworms. Lu Xiaoyi was very clear about his current level. He was at the entry level of the Chi-Eater stage, which was the lowest level possible. He could barely feel the existence of the spiritual opportunity in the world, but he was still far from being able to manipulate it. He was also far from being able to learn spells. With his level of cultivation, he was afraid that he could not even release a small flame. This point was strictly stipulated in the medium parallel chi formula. Only when the middle dantian was filled with heat and felt bloated would it be the time to start learning spells. Now, eating chi, the word eating was the foundation of cultivation. He still had to rely on the worms. With his first experience, his psychological resistance was much stronger. When he saw the white sandworms again, he felt less disgusted and more affectionate. After all, they were partners that helped him with his cultivation. He had to treat them well. Lu Xiaoyi stripped down to his upper body. He wanted to see what the white sandworm's tail hook was. He gently removed the porcelain bottle cap and kept it open at the same level as last night. 10 or so worms were enough for him. He had just entered the entry level, so he could not run away. He would be wasting his time. Just like yesterday, another dozen or so white sandworms jumped out. Once they landed on the ground, they immediately attacked the person they sensed danger from. The only difference was that the person who was attacked no longer panicked. Instead, he watched the white sandworm's actions with great interest. When he saw the tiny flesh worms approaching him, he arched his body and turned around before a white light shot out from his tail and entered his body. It was almost the same pain and swelling as last night. However, because he was confident, he could endure it. At the same time, he channeled his qigong to move the 10 or so tiny streams of spiritual opportunity that entered his body. After 2 hours, his body had completely returned to normal. At the same time, he had also completely digested the white sandworm's spiritual opportunity. During this process, he had come to 2 conclusions. First of all, the white sandworm's tail hook did not actually exist. It was not a real thing like a wasp. It was just a figment of the imagination of an ordinary person who was stung. It was not a real tail hook. It was a pure spiritual vigor that was shot out from its tail. Secondly, he could not completely absorb the white sandworm's spiritual opportunity. He could only absorb half of it. The rest was slowly spreading out and merging with the heaven and earth. He knew that this was because he was not proficient enough in the parallel qi formula, and it was not attractive enough. One day, when his cultivation level was strong enough, he would be able to absorb all the spiritual opportunity in just one cycle of the qi formula. However, when that day came, he would not be interested in the spiritual opportunity of the white sandworm anymore, right? He had never thought that he would cultivate by being stung by insects in such an unimaginable way. It did not matter if it was a black cat or a white cat. As long as it could catch mice, it was a good cat. Chapter 46. As for how to make use of being stung by the worms to increase his cultivation, he needed to explore the process. How could he optimize it? Was it better to absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, or to use the white sandworms? Was there a limit to the number of times he could use the white sandworms? Was there a bottleneck in a single day? How many white sandworms should he release at a time? Based on the increase in his cultivation, the number of white sandworms he released would definitely increase. Then, what was the basis for determining the number of worms he released? These questions needed to be slowly explored in his cultivation and could not be rushed. After solving the problem of his cultivation, he would have a start and finally have a goal in his future life. But now, there was still a thorny problem. How was he going to pass the summer quarter examination? How was he going to let his mother not be disappointed? This was also very important. Although it was meaningless in the long run, it could be everything to an old person. Lu Xiaoyi could not change his mother's mindset, so he could only cater to her. He had a limitless future, but his mother did not. He could not wait until he was successful in his cultivation and became famous before regretting why he did not fulfill his mother's wishes. In the end, he would end up like those so-called filial sons who made their parents angry and disappointed when they were alive, but after they died, they built their tombs into palaces and cried until they wanted to die. This was not filial piety, it was a show for others. In his current situation, it was impossible for him to focus on his studies. Firstly, his soul was not in tune with the cultural attitudes of this world. Secondly, he was worried about his cultivation, so he could not devote himself wholeheartedly to it. For a soul of a loser from his previous life, if he could not pass the exam, he could just cheat. He did not feel pressured by this, and he was not obsessed with cleanliness. "Little husband, are you going out again? Does mistress know?" Ping'an was having a headache now. His little master had changed so much in the past few months. If he hadn't been by his side every day, he would have suspected that it was the same person. The previous 17 years of worry and fear added up was not as much as the past few months. It made a comfortable job full of challenges. If this continued, should he ask for a raise? Lu Xiaoyi glared at him. This fellow had lived a comfortable life for too long, and did not have the slightest awareness of taking responsibility for his master. "In the city! I don't have to report to anyone about going to Lisan's residence, right? Ping'an, you have to remember your position. I don't want to hear similar words in the future. Whether or not I ask mother for instructions, that's my business. It's not something you should care about." The reason why they were going to visit the richest family was something that Chi'er and his gang had occasionally mentioned when they were hanging out. There were also a few scholars among the collateral descendants of the Li family who had passed the scholarly examination. This made Chier and his gang have some guesses. They were all very familiar with each other and knew each other's background, so they were very disdainful of those people who could suddenly become scholars. In their opinion, the Li family must have done something behind the scenes, or bribed the examiner, or found a gunman who knew the questions in advance. Lu Xiaoyi had heard of it before, but it had nothing to do with him. Now that things had come to a head, he remembered this story. Of course, it was impossible to bribe the examiner. There were too many variables. If Mother found out one day, she would definitely break his legs. The best thing was to know the questions. He didn't need to find a gunman and could piece it together himself. The greatest ability that the experience of his previous life gave him was to write his own thing through a certain degree of learning from others' strengths. He had written countless manuscripts all these years. He was very good at piecing things together. For this kind of thing, he definitely couldn't find a scholar. Because it was easy for scholars to cause trouble. Maybe they helped you for a while for a favor or for money, but who knows when they would find their conscience in the future and jump out to cause big trouble. The conscience of a scholar was like this. When they were hungry, they were different. When they were full, they were different. It was completely unpredictable. They were not like businessmen. They at least had a principle, equivalent exchange. Moreover, he had saved Li San's life, right? With the Li family stepping in and using the Li family's disciples' ambition as an excuse, they would leak some information to him. There would be no future trouble. They could totally deny it afterwards. Entering and leaving the Li family's residence was very low-key. After all, the rumors had not completely died down. He entered through the side gate, but was personally led by a housekeeper. Along the way, he was very polite and respectful. Li San Lang stood in front of his courtyard. When he saw Lu Xiaoyi, he waved excitedly, and then pulled him in. Little Yi, don't mind it. Third brother can't take half a step out of this courtyard. Otherwise, this old man won't give you any face. Li San's courtyard was very luxurious. However, this was relative to Lu province. In the Li family's residence, his courtyard was very ordinary. Both parties took a seat in the courtyard. The servants served fragrant tea. Before Li San could speak, Lu Xiaoyi had already taken out a scroll from his sleeve. This is the first time I've come to your residence. I don't have much to take. The Li family is wealthy. My Lu province's family background can't compare. I only have a scroll to express my gratitude. Li San Lang was very surprised. His Li family was wealthy, that was true. However, Lu province was expensive, but it was also not bad. Scholars admired themselves for being virtuous and had bad tempers. It was already very difficult for Lu Xiaoyi to visit him. Now that Lu Xiaoyi had brought a gift, he was a little flattered. In this world, if a family was expensive, they would definitely become rich. However, the rich might not be expensive. Therefore, although the Li family was the richest family in Pu City in terms of status, they were still somewhat restrained in real situations. In front of the truly powerful, they were nothing. Therefore, when Lu province had rejected Lu Sima's handwriting, they had been ashamed for many years. However, they could not show it. When he opened the scroll, Li San couldn't see anything special about it. However, no matter how incompetent he was, he could still see the inscription at the bottom of the scroll. With one look, he immediately knew the value of this scroll. It was not the amount of money, but the meaning it expressed. Xiaoyi, this is Lu Sima's masterpiece. Why did you take it out yourself? Lu Xiaoyi smiled and explained. This is not Xiaoyi's idea. If it were up to me, a table of Wanshan restaurant's banquet would be enough. Isn't this playing the lute to a cow for you? This is Mother's idea. She said that since it's your first time visiting, it's not good to come empty-handed. Li San Lang was very experienced and knew what this meant. This scroll was not something he could accept. He had directly called for his servant and instructed him to deliver it to his master. This was the only way to be considered equal. He knew that after today's incident, the relationship between the Lu and Li families would most likely be reversed. It was good for everyone, so why not? He knew, and so did Lu Xiaoyi. This was his mother's good intentions. This was a strategy where she played the bad cop and Lu Xi played the good cop. This allowed him to slowly build his own network. One day, even if she was no longer around, there would still be people to help her son. This was usually a method left for the heir by the emperor. The old emperor suppressed talents, and once the new emperor used them, they would immediately become his confidants. This should be his father's method, which was the closest to being the emperor. His mother was just following the plan. However, regardless of the reason, the deep meaning of his parents made him sigh. Chapter 47. The two of them sat opposite each other and chatted. The topic of conversation could not stray away from the exploration of the mystery. Back then, 2 of the little 6 righteous brothers died, 2 were injured, and 2 left. They had completely fallen apart. When they talked about this, the 2 of them felt a little down. Things had changed with the passage of time, and they felt a sense of loss. Thus, he changed the topic. Xiaoyi, there are only the 2 of us left in Pu City. I won't hide it from you. After the confinement ends and the old master's anger subsides, I'm afraid I won't be able to stay here any longer. I'll have to go out and run around. It's very likely that I'll have to stay in the capital for a long time. This time, my old master is really angry with me. He's angry that I don't know when to stop even though I'm a few years older than you. But I'm also suffering. There's actually another reason why I joined you. Lu Xi asked. What's the reason? I also feel that we weren't close to each other in the first place. How did we get together just like that? Third brother, what's your motive? Tell me the truth. Li San Lang was very embarrassed. I'm ashamed to say this, but I was entrusted by someone. I'll tell you about this later. You'll understand very soon. But Xiaoyi, you and I know a little about each other. Did you come to look for me this time for something? Just tell me. If I'm not in the residence in a few days, you won't be able to find me. Lu Xiaoyi did not stand on ceremony. He had to beat around the bush when talking to scholars, but there was no need to do so with a businessman. Since you owe me a favor, I'll find an excuse to return it. Everyone will be at ease. You also know that there's an examination this summer. Talented people compete. Mother wants me to pass the examination, or else I'll have to marry and have children. I won't be free. At first, it didn't matter. Although I'm not considered outstanding, I didn't study for nothing for the past 10 years. It's probably not difficult to pass the literature examination. But ever since the cave carvings disaster, I've been feeling uneasy and distracted. I'm afraid that I'll lose control of myself. If the young master of Lu province fails the examination, who knows how many people will gossip about me? Li San Lang nodded. Little E is right. I just happen to have something to remind you of. As far as I know, those poor and destitute people in Pu City are probably going to join forces and stir up trouble. They're targeting our cave carvings rescue mission this time. They said that they're using the power of the government and using public resources for private purposes. They're planning to submit a petition to the Minister of Education. Among the 8 of us, the rest of us don't care. We don't even take the exam, so we can let them do whatever they want. You're the only one who's different. You're a scholar, and there's going to be an exam this summer, so... Lu Xiaoyi realized something. Is someone deliberately targeting me? Li San laughed. Of course. Who told you to hit my head with a brick and make a fool of yourself? Lu Xiaoyi suddenly realized that it was this guy who was secretly stirring up trouble. This person is still in Pu City? How dare you collude in private? Li San shook his head. He's smart. At that time, the old mistress of your residence passed down a message to suppress his scholarly achievements for a few years. In the end, this destitute person is also quite capable. I don't know how he managed to hook up with Miss Lin, the county magistrate of Lanwei County. With Lanwei County's recommendation, He's already gone to the prefecture. The ones who stayed here to stir up trouble are his destitute friends. He's actually completely removed himself from this mess. Little e, this person is not to be underestimated. He's very scheming. If you want to deal with him, strike hard and get it done once and for all. Lu Xiaoyu was a little speechless. He didn't know that his mother would do such a thing after the incident. In the eyes of a poor scholar, this was abusing one's power to bully others, colluding with the rich and powerful, and was unpardonably evil. However, from Lu Xiaoyu's perspective, he saw a mother's love and care for her son. Was there even a need to say which side his ass was sitting on? How much of a hypocrite did a son have to be to stand on the side of so-called justice? Li Sanlang continued. Every summer's imperial examination questions are set by the local government. In Pu City, the prefect and the scholar of Dao discuss it together. Only the two of them know about it. It's sealed in the storehouse and guarded by soldiers day and night. It's impossible for outsiders to know about it. Seeing Lu Xiaoyu looking at him quietly, Li San smiled. Of course, we're not outsiders. If we want to know, we can do so. Little e, you don't have to worry about this matter. Just leave it to me. In the past years, the questions were set 3 days before the examination. I'll need some time to deal with it. I'll send the questions to your residence about 1 to 2 days before the examination. You've never asked me for help, and I've never helped you. Before the examination, I'll send you a banquet to cheer you up. Lu Xiaoyu smiled. Third brother, if you have such convenience, why don't you take the examination yourself? It'll be more convenient for you to go out if you have a Wenjing with you. Li Sanlang shook his head. Me? Not suitable. Among the upper echelons of Pu City, there's not a lot of demand for Wenjing. You know that there are only so many rich and influential families. Which family has a disciple who makes progress every year? Besides, it's just a Wenjing, not a Wenjing. It's just a title and can't be taken seriously. My Li family is a businessman, and we value genuine goods at a fair price. We can have our methods, but they're all within limits. For someone like me, who's not good at studying, if you insist on using a Wenjing as a title, once someone tries to stir up trouble and accuses me of bribing the government, the losses will be greater than the gains, so it's meaningless. Lu Xiaoyu sighed. The Li family knows when to advance and when to retreat. No wonder their business is so big. Actually, it's good to go on the trade route. You'll be free and at ease, and you'll also be a guest of the prefect. If you want to become an official, who knows how many years you'll have to endure before you can step through the doors of the prefect's office. Li San thought about it. He probably felt that this young master from Lu province was indeed very compatible. Moreover, in a short while, he spoke the truth. The prefect won't do such a thing. His family is rich, and he doesn't lack money. He only wants to climb up the social ladder, so he's very strict in this aspect. Lu Xiaoyu laughed. So it's actually. But I see that Lord Xuedao is usually very serious. I didn't expect him to reveal such a thing. Li San said disdainfully. The more serious he looks on the surface, the more dirty and filthy he is in private. Otherwise, why do you think that he, a poor scholar with no family business, would marry 3 or 4 concubines? The servants served wine and food. It was different from what Lu Xiaoyu had imagined. It wasn't wine and meat, but some light snacks. Li San suggested. Why don't we find someone who can play music? Lu Xiaoyu laughed. Third brother, in your current situation, how can you find someone who can play music from outside? Will the old master of your family turn a blind eye? He wasn't interested in the music of this world. He didn't appreciate music from the same point. However, everyone liked it, so he couldn't stand out too much. It was just a way to adjust the atmosphere. However, there was no need to do so in a private setting like this. It was also a way to tactfully decline. However, Li San insisted. If it's not from outside, then it's from within the family. The old master won't say anything. The guests should follow the host's wishes. Since Li San said so, there was no need to insist. While they were eating and drinking, a graceful figure walked in with a pipa in her arms. Her face was covered with a veil, making her look hazy. Every step she took, she had a seductive charm. Lu Xiao was a meticulous person. He noticed two things that were very unusual. First, Li San revealed a strange expression when he saw this musician. It seemed to be disdainful and helpless. For a normal musician, the most basic etiquette would be to bow to the two of them, and then earnestly request for music before performing. However, this musician didn't care about such etiquette at all. She found a stool and sat down. She tuned the strings and plucked the music. Perhaps, this was the style of a rich family? Chapter 48. After the song was played, Li San Lang cheered loudly, but his words were insincere. Although Lu Xiaoyi's knowledge of music was limited, he had heard a lot these days and had some insights. Although this woman's technique was skilled, she was far from being a master. She was far inferior to those musicians in Chao Feng brothel. How did she enter the Li residence and become a concubine? He looked at Li San curiously. Li San was a little embarrassed and said, "Second sister, you say it yourself. I can't do this. In order to bring Master Lu to the Li residence, I almost lost my life in the Gobi Desert. Isn't this a great favor to you?" The musician, who should be Li San's second sister, walked over gracefully. She opened her red lips and spoke in a hoarse voice, a typical smoker's voice. "Master Lu, this is the second time we meet, right? At the Spring Rain Pavilion at Shirya Lake, you even answered two of my questions." Lu Xiaoyi suddenly understood. To be honest, at the Spring Rain Pavilion, he didn't have the chance to see the faces of the three women behind the table. He wasn't in the mood to see them either. However, he vaguely felt that one of them had a voice similar to the woman in front of him. It wasn't that he was sensitive to women's voices, but this woman's voice was too special. He hurriedly stood up. "So it was second sister who played the song. Little E, how fortunate. Third brother hid it from me and caused me to be impolite. You should punish me with a cup of wine." The woman walked over gracefully and sat down on an embroidered stool a few feet away from the table. The fragrance of her fragrance was intoxicating. Although the women in this world couldn't drink with the guests at the same table as in his previous world, they could still sit and chat. "Master Lu, what do you think of my song?" Lu Xiaoyi laughed in his heart. He had already guessed the woman's intention. She asked 2 questions at the spring festival and sent her brother to rope him in. What was the reason? It was just an old cow wanting to eat young grass. What was so difficult to guess? He had heard Chier and the others chatting about this before, saying that the richest Li family had a rebellious daughter. She did things in an eccentric manner and was different from the rest. She had married twice and caused the death of 2 children. Now she might as well stay in her parents' home and be very carefree. Originally, this kind of personality was very difficult to tolerate among everyone, but the Li family was rich. Most importantly, this daughter of the Li family was very favored by the old man. She was the only girl in Li San's generation, so she might be a little arrogant because of the favor. The problem was, he didn't refuse. He couldn't go to the turbid brothel because it would tarnish the reputation of Lu province. He didn't want to marry a wife because he was afraid of being restricted. Now that there was such a woman who had delivered herself to his doorstep, why not flirt with her? He didn't need to spend any money, and he might even be able to pay for it. He didn't need to worry about his friends remarrying. It was better than those young girls who were like bean sprouts, right? He had experience in dealing with such women who felt that they were different from the rest. She's average. She's even worse than the singers outside. Li San, who was next to him, kept glancing at him, but he acted as if he didn't see it. For a strange woman like second sister, you don't need to take music seriously. You don't need to please anyone. Why bother? Second sister Li smiled like a flower and pointed at Li San with her slender fingers. You see, young Master Lu is an honest man. What he says is honest. But you always praise my music skills. Do you think I'm stupid? Li San Lang secretly cursed his bad luck. He realized that he might have made a mistake as the middleman this time. The four brothers had been secretly competing for a long time. In the end, who would be the head of the family and lead the whole family's business? It was hard to explain in a few words. This was also a common problem in a merchant's family. In this world, splitting up the family's business was not popular. Merchants all felt that splitting up the family's power and strength meant that it was a disaster that would eventually lead to decline. Therefore, they all had one son in charge, and each had their own focus. His four sons were all adults. Although the competition hadn't reached its climax yet, it was beginning to show signs. Not only in business, but also in the internal affairs of the family. Each of them had their own tricks up their sleeves. Some started from their mother's side, some started from their maternal relatives, some worked hard, and some had honey in their mouths. Li San's backer was his second sister. She was one of the few people in the family who could act spoiled and unreasonable in front of the old man. This time, the big incident in the Gobi Desert happened. Although part of the reason was to act as a pimp for second sister, after the incident, second sister did her best to help him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have the opportunity to go to the capital to take care of business. Originally, he thought that second sister was just curious and wanted to see something new. Because of the scene at the spring festival. Others might not know, but how could he not know? His second sister was a bit shrewish and did things a bit erratically, but she was not a fickle person. In his opinion, the young master of Lu province must have high standards. He would not marry anyone who was not from a prestigious family. He would not accept anyone who was not from a wealthy family. It was impossible for him to fall in love with second sister, whom he had already married twice, before marriage. With the status of Lu province, even if he wanted to be a concubine, it was impossible for him to marry someone who had already married twice and caused the death of her husband's family. Therefore, it was most likely that they would meet and be friends. At the right occasion, they would support each other. What else could it be? But with this meeting, as astute as he was, he could see that Lu Xiaoyi was not a well-behaved person. Looking at this situation, it was likely that they would create a pair of lovers to relieve each other's emptiness. This pair of adulterous man and woman. Both the guests and the host enjoyed themselves and left. Second sister Li returned to her residence. Li San walked Lu Xiaoyi to the door of his courtyard, but unexpectedly, an old man who looked like a housekeeper hurried over. Lu Xiaoyi did not recognize him, but Li San was very familiar with him. He was the old master's trusted aide, and even Li San had to give him a few glances. The old man handed over a roll of paper that was tied up with a ribbon. Lu Xiaoyi understood that he was not allowed to read it here. How can I accept this? It is already an honor to be received by brother Li San. How can I accept gifts from an elder? The old man smiled and said, Young Master Lu, there is no need to be so polite. This is a matter between the Lu and Li families. Young Master can go back and hand it over to Madam. Young Master and San Lang will hand it over to you. It has nothing to do with anything else. Lu Xiaoyi could only accept it. With a slight pinch, he knew that it was also a piece of paper. Presumably, it was also an elegant item like calligraphy and painting. He dismissed it with a smile. Seeing the old man leave, Li San said, Chi you! Lu Xiaoyi knew what he wanted to say and stopped him. You don't have to say anything. I know everything. The most important thing in a person's life is to be happy. Just like today, second sister is happy, your friends are happy, and the old master is happy. Why aren't you happy? Why should you restrict yourself because of the so-called etiquette? Why should you make your friends and family unhappy? Second sister doesn't have much time left. She will get married sooner or later. Before that, why don't you leave him with a happy memory? After he finished speaking, he turned around and left. After taking a few steps, he turned back. Also, you have to pay more attention to my matters. If you don't do it well, I won't be happy. If I'm not happy, you can forget about being happy. Inviting a wolf into the house, this was Li San Lang's most direct feeling. Forget it. In any case, he would be leaving Pooh's city soon. As for the matter between these two adulterous men and women, what did it have to do with him? Chapter 49. Lu Yaoshe opened the scroll, glanced at it, and sighed. Aunt Saihuan did the same. Lu Xiaoyi was curious. "Mother, what's that? I thought it was a piece of calligraphy or a painting." Lu Yaoshe did not speak, but Aunt Saihuan explained. "Xiaoyi, you've never worried about the family's financial resources, so you don't understand. This is a land deed. Although it's not big, only a few dozen mu, it's the natural moat between the two villages in Lu province. Your mother has thought of many ways to connect the two villages, but in front of these local tyrants, she has never been able to do so. Today, the master of the Li family sent this thing. When the 3 land deeds are combined, it's a big village. The annual income will increase by a lot." Seeing Lu Xiaoyi nonchalantly nod and return to his room to rest, Aunt Saihuan snorted. "He's used to stretching his hands. He doesn't know the burdens of the family at all. Miss, should we let him participate in the family's affairs in the future?" Lu Yaoshe slowly shook her head. "No, he's already done very well. His personality isn't suitable for these things. Xiaoyi has grown up. In a few years we'll see how he settles down. It won't be too late to decide then." Lu Xiaoyi returned to his private space, the study room. Now that he had settled the matter of the imperial examination, he could answer to his mother. Of course, the rest of the time would be spent on his own interests. In the evening, he began to cultivate qi. After 2 hours, he silently observed his progress. Then, he released a dozen white sandworms and compared them after absorbing them. With a comparison, he could know the pros and cons of each method. Then, he would know where he should focus his energy. In terms of effect, the 2 methods were not much different. The effect was even better when he cultivated for 4 hours in the evening. However, he was also very clear that there was a limit to how much he could increase his cultivation through the spiritual vigor of heaven and earth. Even if he became more and more familiar with the parallel qi formula, the spiritual vigor in this world was limited. As his cultivation increased, the 2 hours in the evening would become more and more useless. However, through the use of white sandworms, there was a lot of room for improvement. For example, he could absorb 20, 30, or even 100 worms at once. Hopefully, there were enough white sandworms in the Gobi Desert to last until the day he found another way to improve himself. Now, he had another problem. How was he going to get enough money to buy the dolphin thread incense? As the young master of Lu province, he still had some private savings. This came from various festivals, occasions, and gifts from friends and relatives. Although the master of Lu province, Major Lu, was no longer around, his influence still lingered. His former students and old friends would even specially come to visit him whenever they passed by Pooh's city. Of course, they would not come empty-handed. The gifts they gave to the children were also very expensive. Furthermore, there were gifts for birthdays and festivals. The original Lu Xiaoyi lived a simple life and did not have much to spend. So now, even though his mother had taken away most of it, he still had 100 taels of silver left. It was enough for him to buy 20 bottles of dolphin thread incense. But how long could 20 bottles last? It was hard to say. The higher one's cultivation, the greater one's consumption. Without a fixed source of income, it would be difficult to continue. Cultivation was beautiful in one's imagination, but when one went deep into it, every step was difficult. How could it be so simple? No matter what, he had a good start. He made a strict plan for himself. He would eat qi at 5 o'clock, train his body at 7 o'clock, and absorb the white sandworms at 9 o'clock. After that, he would have lunch, rest, read, eat qi at 5 o'clock, and absorb the white sandworm's spiritual vigor at 9 o'clock. Basically, he would eat qi from heaven and earth twice a day and use the white sandworms twice a day. This was because he felt that there was a bottleneck in the human body's absorption of spiritual vigor. He was not always in the best condition. The quality of absorption was not only determined by the intensity of the spiritual vigor or the number of white sandworms, but also the state of one's mind and body. The effect would only be good if one rested well, ate well, and was in a good mood. To Taoists, Taoism was the foundation of nature. What was nature? To have no desires was nature. One could not be impatient, or filled with hatred. Otherwise, one would only achieve half the result with twice the effort. Let nature take its course, find freedom, and achieve great liberation. This was not just a saying. It contained the deepest truth of Taoism. 10 days later, the white sandworms were all used up. Lu Xiaoyi counted the worms lying motionless in the porcelain bottle. There were about 300 to 400 of them. His body's tolerance had reached the level of absorbing 30 white sandworms at once. Moreover, when the white sandworm's spiritual vigor entered his body, he no longer felt the unbearable pain like before. His body was no longer swollen. This was because his body had adapted to the spiritual vigor. At this time, the changes in his body finally showed. First, the most obvious change was that his vision had improved greatly. In this world, there was no concept of eye care. Therefore, the scholars in this world were more or less short-sighted. The poorer they were, the more short-sighted they were. This was because they had to save on lamp oil. It would be strange if their eyes did not go bad if they looked at a lamp for half a night. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi did not have to suffer so much. However, his reading habits were not good. His eyes were too close to the scrolls, so he was slightly short-sighted. However, since he had succeeded in his cultivation, his vision had not only returned to normal under the nourishment of the spiritual vigor, but there were also some wonderful changes. It was not only his eyes that had changed. All the organs in his body, such as his nose, ears, teeth, heart, arms, and legs, were more vigorous. Even his urination and defecation were much cleaner. This was not a joke. This was the embodiment of a healthy digestive system. Even if he had to defecate, he could do it without any hesitation. 1, 2, 3, he could leave with his pants up. He did not even have to clean his hands because there was nothing to clean. Cultivation, spiritual opportunity, and the transformation of the body were imperceptibly changing with each passing day. Perhaps it wasn't reflected on the outside, but the changes within the body were obvious. This feeling was intoxicating. Exercise was addictive because you could feel the vitality of the body. Cultivation was a change of a higher level than exercise. It was easy to imagine how attractive it was to humans. This was also the reason why once people came into contact with cultivation, they could no longer bear to give it up. Of course, Qi and Li San did not count. The feeling of power obtained from spiritual objects was too sudden and too short. It did not have the process of becoming stronger by oneself. Just like sex, what one enjoyed was the process, and not just passing on one's ancestral line. Speaking of passing on one's ancestral line, his ability had improved a lot. This was also a natural thing. The spiritual vigor would not forget about it just because it was shameful to see people. Instead, it treated every part of the body fairly. This made him start to have some expectations for second sisterly. This woman had not done anything for 10 days. She was playing hard to get with him. How could she know that in Lu Xiaoyi's young body, there was an experienced and wretched soul that had been immersed in the mortal world for a long time? Lu Xiaoyi received the wholesale price of 4 taels of silver for a bottle of dolphin-threaded incense from the grocery store shopkeeper. This was not because he was bullying him with his status as a young master of Lu province. In business, the wholesale price and retail price were different. Who else in Pu City would be so generous to buy 20 bottles at once? During this period, Lu Xiaoyi had to speed up. This was because the most dangerous part of the qi-eating stage was the initial stage. If one could not keep up with the cultivation at this stage, the spiritual vigor would inevitably regress after the body's transformation. Just like Qi and Li San, they would slowly return to being ordinary people. In the end, they would just be ordinary people who were slightly stronger. Therefore, his goal was to try his best to achieve initial success in chi eating. This way, he could stabilize and consolidate this rare and precious situation. Then, he would slowly look for a way to progress further on this foundation. From an ordinary person to a cultivator, this change required a large amount of spiritual vigor. This was a hurdle that he could not bypass. This was also mentioned in the summary of cultivation in Mount Zhong. There was also a solution, which was to consume pills, such as the qi-eating pill and the qi-nourishing pill. It seemed that these things could be bought at any time and anywhere in the major medicine stores. It was easy for him to say that. This author was also someone who played with theory and did not talk about reality. Chapter 50. With the experience from the first time, it was much easier to catch the worms the second time. Ping'an was not as resistant as before. Everything was like this. Once you had the first time, the second time would naturally become normal. This time, they walked a few miles deeper into the desert. Lu Xiaoyi was worried that there would be a fixed number of white sandworms in a certain area, so he had to avoid the previous location. Before catching the worms, he first found a place to release the 300 to 400 white sandworms that had lost their spirit hooks. When these worms saw the desert, they were like fish that saw water. They disappeared into the sand almost instantly. He did not know if they would remember this lesson and not be tricked again. This time, he placed the 2 porcelain bottles further away from each other. In theory, this would attract more worms, and the time it took to store the bottles was twice as long. However, the amount of dolphin thread incense was reduced by half. He needed to find the most economical amount of incense. Otherwise, with his current wealth, it would be difficult for him to maintain the incense for a long time. In the end, he was neither surprised nor disappointed. Last time, there were 100 to 200 worms in each bottle. This time, there were about 200 worms. Because the time it took to store the bottles was twice as long, it meant that the amount of incense used could not be reduced anymore. Otherwise, it would be a wasted trip. If the harvest was greatly reduced because of the lack of incense, it would be like throwing away a watermelon for a sesame seed. Based on his current consumption of the white sandworms, and taking into account that his cultivation level had increased to a certain extent, 400 worms could provide him with about 10 days' worth of energy. As time went on, this period would become shorter and shorter. Until one day, it would be pointless to capture the worms and bring them back. It would be better to capture them on the spot and absorb them on the spot. There was no shelter in the Gobi Desert. To cultivate in this place, one would have to consider how to avoid being disturbed by the occasional passers-by. It was a very troublesome thing. Lu Xiaoyi had long discovered that the spiritual vigor of the Gobi Desert was denser than that of Pu's city, Lu Province. This was in line with the laws of nature. The appearance of humans had caused all natural things to retreat, including green and spiritual vigor. The pure quality of spiritual vigor was the white sandworm's strong point, but its meager spiritual energy made it very awkward to absorb. Lu Xiaoyi had successfully brought himself into the cultivation world through this worm, but he realized that was all there was to it. At most, he could stabilize himself until he reached the early stage of cheating. The white sandworm's effect would become infinitely small, so small that it was negligible. The cultivators in this world were not all fools. If the white sandworms could really help people achieve something in their cultivation, they would not have been left to their own devices. The reason why they could survive in the Gobi Desert was because the truly capable cultivators did not think much of them. As soon as the path was opened, he realized that it was just a small path. He needed to find another direction. This made Lu Xiaoyi, who was used to being lazy, very annoyed. He wanted his life to be comfortable and not rushed. Just like in the other world, he had to run around in the busy reinforced concrete all day long like a worker ant. He wanted to be a bird. He wanted to be free in the sky, eating and waiting for death. It would be best if he was a myna or a parrot. If he was unhappy, he could even scold people. Originally, this kind of life was not difficult for him. Lu Province could not guarantee that he would be rich, but he would not have to worry about food and clothing. As long as he did not have high expectations, he could still maintain some dignity. However, Lu Xiaoyu was a little greedy. He wanted to live for a few more decades, so he had problems with his cultivation. He also had a little filial piety. He did not want to disappoint the elders, so he had problems with the big exam. He also had needs for his body, so he had problems with second sisterly. Wherever he went, Lu Xiaoyu was not a person with strict self-discipline. He liked to make plans, but he could rarely complete them. Most of the time, he ended up with nothing in the process because of one reason or another. This was also the reason why he was a loser in his previous life. When he returned to the mansion, he was just in time for his cultivation. In theory, practicing diligently every day was the foundation of cultivation progress. However, this was under the premise of abundant spiritual opportunity. In this low-level cultivation environment, due to the limitation of spiritual opportunity, practicing diligently was not as effective as practicing intelligently. The occasional pause was both out of helplessness and necessity. Ping'an sent him a letter. It was a fragrant letter. When Lu Xiaoyu read the letter, he was very worried. This was not a letter that a man would use. Then, the source of the letter was very strange. He never thought that his young master could have a romantic encounter in this aspect, but reason told him that no matter what happened to his young master, there was no need to be surprised. His young master had completely changed since he came into contact with Chier's group. Lu Xiaoyu looked at Ping'an, who wanted to say something but stopped. He knew what he was thinking. This was the disadvantage of a rich family. Everything they did, there would be people watching them. You don't have to worry about this. It's not a messy person. Just friendship? I understand, the kind that lasts for a long time. Don't worry about what will happen. I know what to do. You see, we went to the Gobi Desert several times. What happened? How's the thing I asked you to do? What kind of family did Aunt Kai Huan find for me? This is a big deal. You can't be confused. I will ask around. Don't worry, young master. In the past, when he said this, he was basically perfunctory. How would he dare to inquire about what Aunt Kai Huan was busy with? But ever since he was tied to the same boat as his young master, his thoughts had changed. Especially after he sent this letter, his attitude became even more firm. His young master would be 18 years old in the next year. In other rich families, half of them would have already married and had children at this age. The other half would also have a rough result. Therefore, it was normal for his young master to be anxious in this aspect. It was natural for a young man to fall in love. When it was season, even cats would howl on the roof, let alone humans. He decided to be more serious this time and do what his young master asked him to do. This way, his young master might not have anything to do with those messy people outside. 11 days had passed since he succeeded in eating chi for the first time. There were still 80 days before the summer examination. Lu Xiaoyu made a basic judgment of his own timeline. He believed that, in view of the concept of combining work and rest and relaxing the mind, it was necessary to relax himself appropriately. He was almost 19 years old, and his body was close to adulthood. He needed his own privacy. Among the 13 cultivation bamboo slips, there was not a single one that mentioned the requirement of cultivating as a child. That was nonsense. It was a misunderstanding and fabrication by mortals about cultivation. The letter was sent by second sister Li. She invited him to the Li residence's side courtyard to admire the lanterns tomorrow night. What was there to admire about lanterns? For an old soul like Lu Shi, there was no need for anyone to teach him what it meant. Food, drink, men and women. No matter what kind of world it was generally like this. Chapter 51. On the whole, Lu Xiaoyu was still training with the mentality of an ordinary mortal. He did not strictly restrict his entertainment behavior, nor did he have any sense of urgency. If he could live for a few more decades, he should be able to walk on at such a speed easily, shouldn't he? Why did he have to push himself so hard like a donkey? What was the point of life if he could not stop and look at the scenery from time to time? Walking alone with a heavy burden? Ha ha! The changes to the body from cultivation were becoming more and more obvious. Strength, speed, reaction, and so on. According to the summary of Mount Jones cultivation, this was the primary goal of the cheating stage. Transforming the body of an ordinary person into a cultivator's body. When this stage was completed, the body's functions would completely meet the needs of cultivation. There would no longer be an uncontrolled demand for spiritual opportunity. Even if the spiritual opportunity was relatively weak in this world, it could still maintain the normal operation of cultivation. In short, it would not go back. Only when he reached this stage could he be considered a real cultivator, and not a half-finished product that swayed between an ordinary person and a cultivator. It was only at this stage that he could start to try magic without worrying that he would be sucked dry by a flame on his finger. It was only at this stage that he could start to think of ways to apply his ability to his family and friends, such as his mother and Aunt Kai Huan, who had many common bad habits that only belonged to this world, the monkey, and the youngest Han. Cultivating 4 times a day had become his daily routine. In the morning, it would be from 5 to 6 o'clock until 9 or 10 o'clock. In the evening, it would be from 5 to 7 o'clock. In the evening, it would be after the sun had set in his previous life. Such a schedule would give him a large amount of time to deal with his messy personal matters. Basically, he would be idle during the middle of the day. In the afternoon, he could eat with his mother, talk, read books, and most importantly, go to the Li family's side courtyard to admire the lanterns. In the eyes of Lu Yaoshe, this was what a good child should do. It was also what a student who was close to the summer examination should do. As for going out occasionally to relax, they did not care about it. Spoiling was the cornerstone of losing judgment. The day Lu Xiaoyi spent all the money in his little treasury was a day worth remembering. This was a cultivation in the evening. He was immersed in a shining golden light. Of course, only cultivators could see and feel it. After 2 months of circulating the parallel Qigong formula, it had already formed a memory in his meridians. Naturally, there was no need for him to deliberately guide and regulate them. In the beginning, he could only absorb the spiritual essence in the air of his study room. Now all the spiritual essence in the air of Lu province was flowing into his courtyard. If there was a higher level existence looking down from above Pu City, they would be able to clearly see that with Lu province as the center, the spiritium above Pu City was automatically replenishing itself in the direction of Lu province due to the imbalance in spiritium intensity. This was actually the simplest and most direct way to observe if there were any cultivators in an area. As long as one hovered in the air between 5 and 5, one could easily discover if there were any cultivators in the area. How many were there? This was because they had caused the orderly flow of spiritual essence in this space. Of course, the small Pu city did not have such capable people. Furthermore, Lu province was not the only one that was causing the orderly flow of spiritual essence here. There were a few other places that were causing even greater movements than Lu province, including the richest family, the Li family. These movements could not be sensed by ordinary mortals. However, it was also because of the existence of these people that this world could still be considered a world of cultivators, and not a pure world of mortals. Lu Xiaoyi was now a tiny seed in this world of cultivators. He was a weed seed that floated wherever it went. In a remote place like Pu City, it could grow into a towering tree. It could also be blown down by the wind or run over by the wheels of a car and become fertilizer. However, today was the day this seed sprouted and broke through the soil. The previous food was like a seed desperately absorbing nutrients under the soil. Now, he could emerge and look at this brand new world. He could proudly say that he was also a member of this world. During the process of channeling qi, there was no sense of existence. There was only a place where spiritual essence flowed. His dantian suddenly felt a faint heat and a swelling sensation. Lu Xiaoyi had been studying these bamboo slips for a long time. Of course, he knew what this meant. He did not dare relax or stop. He continued to circulate his qi as usual. He had already made up his mind. If he could not reach the initial level of success in consuming qi during this evening's cultivation, he would immediately start absorbing the white sandworms. The old man had taught him to chase after a desperate enemy. His dantian became hotter and more swollen. This was because the power of spiritual essence was settling in his dantian. It was being analyzed and turned into a type of power suitable for humans to control. In the words of cultivators, this was spiritual power. Only when spiritual power was formed could a cultivator have the ability to release their power. This could be done through different methods such as spells, talismans, formations, pills, and so on. The weak spiritual power gathered more and more in his dantian, so much so that Lu Xiaoyi didn't need to urge it, it would instinctively follow the path of the qi formula. When he felt that his dantian had a feeling of bursting, like a bladder that hadn't been relieved for a day, he knew that he had reached a very critical stage. On the path of cultivation, there were dangers at every checkpoint. It was just a matter of how many there were. Like this initial success in eating qi, the checkpoint to truly step into the world of cultivation should be the easiest, simplest, and most elementary of the countless checkpoints on the path of cultivation, but there were still risks. This kind of risk was almost guaranteed to be passed under the watch of an elder or the support of a sect's orthodoxy. However, there was still a chance if one was to explore it on their own. Fortunately, the old lord's simple questions had explained this in detail. This allowed Lu Xiaoyi to clearly understand where the risks came from and how to avoid them. The biggest risk was not being able to control it well. When the swelling exceeded a certain threshold, his dantian would burst, just like a balloon that had been constantly inflating. The key to solving the problem was not to stop, but to accelerate. Through the driving of the qi formula, the excess spiritual power would be brought to various parts of the meridians until it formed a natural cycle, growing and multiplying endlessly. This was a kind of balance, and also a kind of gamble. The gamble was to first reach a natural cycle before the dantian could not bear it and burst. The timid would hesitate, the brainless would be impulsive. Only the truly calm would be able to find the most perfect balance in the surging spiritual power in the body. This was the most basic quality of a cultivator. If one could not do this, their future in cultivation would be very limited. Natural selection. At the beginning of cultivation in the universe, nature used this method to test whether or not humans had the potential to cultivate. However, as the power of the orthodoxy grew stronger, this kind of test also lost its meaning under human intervention. Lu Xiaoyi could calmly face all of this because he had an indifferent attitude, an attitude that was happy to lose something and happy to lose something. After a moment, Lu Xiaoyi's entire body shook. The entire spiritual power cycle seemed to have been installed with an engine. The core was his dantian. From then on, the cycle repeated. As long as the spiritual power was there, it would never stop. The pre-celestial earth was originally nothingness, either iron nor gold, like a cauldron. Breathing in and out like the sun and moon, half open and half closed through the skin. Originally, there was no substance, but into the golden pot and drunk jade pot. From then on, one could become a guest of the heavens, plucking white clouds to make a jade house. Chapter 52. From then on, Lu Xiaoyi did not need to exert any effort, nor did he need to be deliberate. With his dantian as the core, this set of qi circulation would accompany him for the rest of his life, never stopping. This kind of circulation had a certain regenerative ability. As long as there was spiritual opportunity in the world, no matter how much there was, as long as there was nutrition in the food, no matter how much there was, under his qi circulation, he could transform it into his own spiritual power. It was hard to say whether he could make progress, but it was theoretically impossible for him to decline. This was true cultivation, unlike Qier and Li San, who placed their hopes on external things. Once the supply of external things was cut off, they would immediately become rootless duckweed, a tree without a source, and could only fall into degeneration. Lu Xiaoyi held back his laughter, shook his sleeves, stood up, and carefully experienced the changes. It was different from before. His perceptive ability was his greatest gain. Since he succeeded in eating qi more than 2 months ago, hearing and seeing had become a derivative of cultivation. However, the distance was limited, and this feeling was most obvious when he was cultivating qi. Once he stopped cultivating and walked in the streets and alleys, he could only hear more clearly and see more clearly. However, it was different now. Because the qi circulating art was constantly circulating, his perception would always remain at the level of a cultivator. It was not like before, where he was a cultivator when he circulated his qi circulating art, and became an ordinary person when he stopped. The change in perception brought a great impact to a person. This was a change that people who had never cultivated could not imagine. An ordinary person's eyesight was no more than 100 feet. Any further and their vision would become blurry because there were too many things to focus on. The same was true for their hearing. There was also the sense of smell and perception. Within a fixed range that they had been used to for more than 10 years, they would combine with the brain to form a judgment, forming the so-called perception. When this distance was expanded several times, the biggest problem was that you had to face more than 10 times the number of targets at the same time. Different people, different creatures, different sounds, different smells, etc. It was equivalent to the brain's operating load suddenly increased by 10 times, or even more. There was a feeling of a breakdown, and this was what Lu Xiaoyi felt most clearly. Biographies often said that after a cultivator achieved a breakthrough, they would feel relaxed and happy, as if the world was under their control, but the real situation was completely different. The world was under their control. Are you sure your little brain can withstand the impact of such a large amount of information? Can it still function normally? No fever? Not short-circuiting? Not tripping? After all, the usage rate of the human brain was very low, and there was too much room for development. It was in this state of headache that Lu Xiaoyi suddenly discovered that there was a shadow in his own consciousness. Qi-consuming cultivators couldn't possibly produce divine sense. This was common sense. They were still at the lowest level of cultivation. Only when they reached the induction period, or perhaps the foundation establishment period, would they be able to possess divine sense. Only then would their spiritual energy truly transform into the magical energy of a cultivator. Only then would they be considered the true power of the cultivation world. In other words, the little grass had grown up and was no longer a sprout. It could experience wind and rain, lightning and thunder. Therefore, the shadow in his mind was very strange. Lu Xiaoyi's first thought was that it was a tumor. Cerebral hemorrhage? But in the next moment, this superficial knowledge was expelled, because when his consciousness came into contact with the shadow, a mysterious feeling revealed the truth. That was not a tumor, but a destiny. What use does it have? He didn't know. What are the benefits? He had no idea either. How do I use it? He still didn't know. He only knew that this shadow was the lowest form of destiny, floating destiny. Floating meant drifting with the wind, unable to control one's body. Wherever the wind blew, one would be there, unable to control it, and one would be at ease. After thinking about it for a while, he finally understood where this thing came from. In the process of his soul drifting in the universe, he didn't know how much time had passed, nor did he know how much time had passed. He only knew that he would continue to drift until he completely lost his consciousness, turning into pure energy and disappearing in the universe. He was able to drift to this world and accurately find the unlucky Lu Xiaoyi because his soul encountered another ball of energy while drifting. With the help of this ball of energy, he didn't disappear and found a new body. Then, it was a little clear now. This ball of energy was the energy of destiny? His future would be a person with great destiny? Lu Xiaoyi's heart began to heat up, but it quickly cooled down. He wasn't sure if he had great destiny, but it was very likely that he had some small destiny. This was because before he encountered this ball of destiny, he felt that there were countless similar energies scattered across the universe. There were hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of them, uncountable. Each of them was incomparably powerful, and he felt that the one that took him away in the end was the weakest of them all. Then, if all of this was true, what did it mean? Would he be able to go further and smoother on the path of cultivation than others? It seemed to be possible. However, there was so much destiny energy, and it was endless. It was as if the heavens were doing wholesale, and what he obtained from it couldn't even be compared to an ant's. If he met other people with destiny, what would happen? It seemed that there was no need to think too much about it. The great destiny would devour the small destiny, and the big fish would eat the small fish. The outcome was obvious. It was as if he had eaten a fly during a feast, and it disgusted Lu Xiaoyi to no end. It wasn't easy to become a cultivator, but he realized that he would always be a small fish being devoured by others. This kind of experience was depressing. He even had the heart to never leave Pooh City, and just stay here for the rest of his life. However, after thinking about it carefully, he still felt that something was wrong. If he didn't leave, how could he stop others from coming in? There were many problems that needed to be solved urgently. Under this sky, in this world, how many other people with destiny energy like him were there? Did the destiny energy he sensed come to this world? Or was it actually scattered across the boundless universe, and not many of them came to this world, or perhaps none at all? If it was the former, he could set up a coffin for himself. If it was the latter, it seemed like he could still do something about it. Since they were both blessed by Providence, could they sense each other's presence? According to this logic, it seemed like the spell he should practice the most was how to conceal this small ball of destiny energy, instead of learning how to set fire or condense ice. What kind of relationship should there be between people with destiny energy? Friends? Relatives? Or enemies that should devour each other? Although he felt that the endless destiny energy came from the same place, if it fell and entered a cultivator's body, the possibility of it becoming an enemy would be higher. There was no basis, it was just his intuition. The higher one went, the narrower the path would be. If these people with destiny energy could get along peacefully and be friendly with each other, it wouldn't conform to the basic laws of cultivation. It was worrisome. Chapter 53. Now that he had reached the small success of the cheating stage, he could finally come into contact with the most exciting things. Perhaps many people cultivated for the sake of longevity, but there was no absolute term for longevity, nor was there any true meaning of longevity. For ordinary mortals, they would be satisfied to live for a few hundred years. Even longevity was something that everyone had different understandings of. On the contrary, many people were more obsessed with those magic-like spells, controlling the wind, controlling the fire, riding the clouds, and riding the mist. The feeling of understanding nature, manipulating nature, and resonating with nature, under such pursuit, longevity might just be a derivative of living in harmony with nature. Who could say for sure? Lu Xiaoyi had such thoughts. As for longevity? It was too far. For a mortal with a few decades of life, was it realistic to ask him to imagine a life of thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of years? Only a fool would set such a goal. Among the 13 bamboo slips, most of them were about spells, such as the wind-rolling escape armor, the 7 forms of fire, the ice chapter of the irregular water, the Taoist talisman, the paper figurine technique, the concealment technique, the analysis of common formations. There were a lot of spells, but Lu Xiaoyi found that among them, there was none that he wanted to learn the most. What did he want to learn the most? First of all, a way to regulate the various functions of the body was the most urgent thing for him, because he wanted to regulate the bodies of his mother and Aunt Saihuan. The lifespan of mortals in this world was not long. The average lifespan was about 60 years. His mother and Aunt Saihuan were over 50 years old this year, and there was not much time left. He did not want to get an extra few decades of life, but he did not want to ignore his loved ones who loved him. No matter what the final result was, one more year was one more year. However, after studying all the bamboo slips, he found that all the spells were suitable for cultivators to cultivate and fight, but there was no way to regulate the body. It made sense when he thought about it. A beginner like him could completely regulate the body inside and outside at the early stage of the cheating stage. How could he need other ways to regulate the body? Spiritual opportunity was the best way to regulate the body. It could only be said that cultivators rarely thought about how to use their abilities to help ordinary mortals. In their opinion, what did it matter if it was a few years earlier or later? In any case, cultivators and mortals were separated. Sooner or later, they would be separated from each other. Perhaps there was, but Lu Xiaoyi didn't know. This kind of help might be limited to pills, but with his current ability, he was afraid that he was powerless to do so. As an extremely important part of the cultivation path, the Tao of pills was also the part that burned the most resources. Wealth, resources, inheritance, experience, and techniques. Even in the orthodoxies of real sex, those who could be involved in this direction were either extremely talented or had a powerful backer behind them. Other than that, there was no third path. According to the summary of Mount Zhong's cultivation, rogue cultivators had never been able to cultivate the Tao of pills. This was because they were simply unable to overcome the despairing consumption and wastage of the early stages of the Tao of alchemy. This required the support of a powerful organization behind them. Alchemists were all created through the use of vast amounts of resources. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi wasn't interested in this. He didn't have anything. In his opinion, he could only use the stupidest method, which was to use spiritual energy to open up the blocked meridians of his mother and Aunt Kaihong every day. This was a slow and meticulous process because the input of spiritual energy had to be controlled to an extremely low level. Otherwise, it would be like the first time he was stung by the white sandworm, causing his entire body to swell. Was this helping or killing people? The second thing he wanted to learn the most was to hide the shadow in his mind. But obviously, this would require an extremely high level of cultivation to be able to do just by imagining. Perhaps he would never be able to do it. By the time he could control his own fate, he would have already become an immortal, right? The third thing he wanted to learn was actually the problem he needed to solve now. It was the problem of how to cheat in the summer examinations. A cultivator who wanted to cheat in a mere exam, he didn't know if there was a second cultivator in the world of cultivation, but he didn't have any psychological burden. He took the exam based on his own ability. So why should he feel guilty? Therefore, if there was a mind-reading technique, insight technique, duplication technique, or a technique that could give him a copy, he would definitely learn it at the first opportunity. Unfortunately, there were no such things, and the cultivation seniors didn't prepare these cheating things for the younger generation. It was a pity that the cultivation world was too conservative when it came to the types of techniques. With such core techniques, hundreds of cheating apps would have been developed long ago. Although Li San confidently patted his chest and said that it would not be a problem, there were countless variables when it came to exams. No one knew what would happen in the end. Even if there were no problems with his essay, if the person marking the paper had any bad intentions and the pen was slightly off, it could still make him regret the summer exams. Lu Xiaoyi hated things that he couldn't control. Unfortunately, his current situation was that his status in Lu province was declining, and his cultivation level was rising. They were both in the same awkward position, neither up nor down. It was very uncomfortable. Since there was nothing he wanted to learn, he could only pick the best out of the worst, and see if there were any techniques that could be used. His mind was very clear that if he wanted to learn techniques now, he couldn't focus on the possibility of fighting. Instead, he should focus on how to continue his cultivation. Whether it was the old lord's essence of gathering qi or the summary of Mount Zhong's cultivation, or the other bamboo slips, they all had the same attitude towards techniques. The simpler the techniques in the stage of eating qi, the better. It was best not to learn anything at all. This was because the real beginning of a cultivator's cultivation in the stage of cultivating techniques was actually in the stage of sensing. It was only after they built their foundation that they would be able to open up a new world. Of course, there was a prerequisite to this saying, and that was that they didn't have to worry about their lives. For sects and forces with powerful backing, this was the right answer. However, for individual cultivators, at the very least, they still had to learn protective spells. When they were outside, they had no one to rely on. They had to rely on themselves for everything. How could they survive without some tricks? Concealment was the first choice. To put it bluntly, it was to pretend to be a turtle. The core idea was that the best way to save one's life was not to defeat the opponent, but to avoid fighting if possible. The safest way was to pretend to be an ordinary person. This suited Lu Xiaoyi very well. They were all civilized people. Why did they have to fight? Wasn't it better to be reasonable? Lu Xiaoyi thought that concealment was more like a special method of circulating qi. It targeted the circulation of qi that every cultivator who consumed qi was constantly circulating. Through some ingenious method, the circulation of qi would be suppressed to the lowest level. Thus, within a certain distance, they would be able to avoid the detection of other cultivators. It was not like how ordinary people understood it, which was to cover oneself with leaves and dig a hole to bury oneself. As for how far this could be deceived, one was the opponent's level of cultivation, and the other was the degree of proficiency. In fact, Lu Xiaoyi also knew that the best way to save one's life was not concealment, but to avoid causing trouble. Since this was his original intention, the second technique he planned to learn was not unexpected. 1 was to be afraid, 2 was to hide, and 3 was to run. This was the best way to save one's life. Concealment and running, of course, he could only choose the wind-rolling escape technique. The tornado escape armor required props, which was to tie 2 small and simple wind wing arrays on the calf. The materials used depended on one's own financial resources. Bamboo could be used, and jade could also be used. Bamboo was the elegance of plants, and could be used with spiritual power. Needless to say, jade was the standard equipment of cultivators, and was very compatible with spiritual power. Relatively speaking, the effect of engraving it on jade was definitely better, and it could be used for a longer time. He couldn't just choose to hide and run. No matter what, he had to learn a technique to beat people and a technique to resist beatings. This way, he could form a system. Thus, from the remaining jade slips, he chose the fire abstinence from the 7 forms of fire and the paper figurine technique. This was a very helpless choice because he found that as the lowest existence in the cultivation world, he didn't even have the ability to build the most basic attack and defense system. The 7 forms of fire was not the so-called heaven and earth sacred flame, strange flame, and other high and mighty things. He was still far from these things. He couldn't touch it. Once he touched it, he would lose his life. The so-called 7 forms, in fact, were divided according to how difficult it was for the cultivator to use qi to produce flames. They were divided into fire abstinence, fire abstinence, fire abstinence, fire abstinence, fire abstinence. Chapter 54. To put it simply, beginners could not borrow the power of nature, nor could they resonate with nature. The only thing they could use was the external manifestation of their own spiritual power, or they could use some external objects to achieve their goals. Under such conditions, the easiest method was, of course, the abstinence technique. To put it bluntly, it was like spitting fire from the mouth of the circus. The only difference was that the performers had oil in their mouths, while the cultivators really spit it out, and the power was very different. Of course, there were also the swindlers who had some foundation in Taoist magic, ignited their spiritual vigor, and had oil in their mouths, which also had a different momentum. In order of difficulty, using the nose to breathe fire was even more difficult. After that, it was the eyes and fingers. These 4 spells all used the body to release fire. Next was the borrowing spell, which used talisman fire, and the transfer spell, which used array fire. Only the void spell, which was the last one, was the real flame of the cultivation world. It could be created out of nothing, appearing and disappearing unpredictably. Therefore, the 7 forms of fire was not divided by the quality of the flame, but by the difficulty of the beginner's fire. It was the most basic thing, like a child's play. This was also the reason why the mainstream level had always been discouraged from practicing magic while eating qi. It was very awkward to attack, and even more awkward to defend. It could be seen from the Ice chapter of Water's impermanence. Because it could not resonate with nature, it took time to cast magic. At the level of Lu Xiaoyi, he might not be able to make an ice crystal shield with defensive effect. By the time he made it, he would have already become a corpse. The instantaneous method did exist, but it was only limited to after-sensing. It was a fact that the cultivators at the stage of eating qi relied on the weapons in their hands to fight like mortals. Because they could inject their spiritual power into it, the effect they could achieve by waving their weapons was far more powerful than that of mortals. It was something that internal strength could not compare to. At this stage, the most economical way for individual cultivators to travel in Jianghu was to carry a sword at the waist and a stack of talismans in the pocket. This was the experience of long-term practice. Experience was precious, and it was piled up with blood. Lu Xiaoyi wanted to change this way and follow his own interests, but he found that he did not have the capital to be different. Talismans required capital. Whether it was professional talisman paper or spirit sand, he didn't have the money to do this right now. Moreover, he didn't know where to buy them, so he could only give up temporarily. On the other hand, the paper figurine technique was more comprehensive. It could defend and attack. However, while it might be useful against ordinary mortals, it was useless against cultivators. After much deliberation, Lu Xiaoyi found that the most suitable thing for him now was to practice martial arts with the old soldiers and strive to overcome this awkward stage of cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi felt very helpless when he stepped into the path of cultivation and returned to his personal strength. He was someone who cherished his life very much. He always felt that his choices were very awkward, so he simply went to sleep. The next day, Lu Xiaoyi cultivated at 5 in the morning. After feeling refreshed, Lu Xiaoyi went through all the spells in his mind again and made a new decision. Stealth, tornado escape armor, reckless ox body, and martial arts from the old soldiers. This was the most convenient way, and also the way to do the least useless work. Since he couldn't figure out what was the best combination of spells, he might as well not learn anything and use reckless ox body and martial arts to replace his own safety during the whole period of eating. Most importantly, if he cultivated a body-strengthening technique, would he be able to find the mystery of how to help mortals adjust their bodies? Even the cleverest housewife can't cook a meal without rice. The things left behind by Laozi are not systematic and are scattered all over the place. It's really difficult. Even for him, the former young master Sima of the secular world. He had to take economic factors into consideration in the process of cultivation. He didn't have the intention to find an organization. First of all, it was difficult to find one. Second, the requirements were too high. He started cultivating at this age, which was already very late in the cultivation world. It might be amazing in the eyes of mortals, but in the eyes of real cultivation forces, it was nothing. It wasn't completely impossible to find such a force, but it required a lot of resources and wealth, and it also required a lot of skin. As a loser in his previous life, one of the biggest characteristics was that he didn't ask for help. Even if he was poor, he wasn't willing to bend over for 5 bushels of rice. This kind of character made him suffer a lot in his previous life, but he still didn't change and brought it back to this world. Lu Xiaoyi's plan for his life was to live for a few more decades and experience the feeling of controlling wind and fire. That was enough. What was the point of living so long? It was very tiring. Therefore, if the spells weren't systematic, it was very important to have a good body. It was not only useful in fighting outside, but also in fighting inside. After having a certain ability to protect himself, he could slowly learn those unconventional spells. Thinking about it, he would have the opportunity to sense it in his lifetime, right? Once he sensed it, Well, that was the foundation establishment. He would have at least a few decades of lifespan. This life was enough, it was that simple. Why should he think about becoming a deity? Why should he be on tenterhooks and avoid other people with luck? Why should he make his life so complicated? Why? Wasn't it good to be a long-lived rice worm? The young maidservant outside reported that Aunt Kai Huan had already entered his courtyard. Lu Xiaoyi hurriedly welcomed Aunt Kai Huan in. Since the age of 15 or 16, the two old madams rarely came to his courtyard. This was also the rule of a big house. When one became an adult, they should have their own privacy and secrets. They couldn't be like a child, staring at everything and not letting go of everything. Looking at the slightly messy layout of the study, Aunt Kai Huan frowned. These servants are really outrageous. It's so messy, but they don't know how to tidy it up. Lu Xiaoyi inched forward to please her. Aunt Kai, I didn't let them in. Every 7 days they clean up. You came at a bad time. Today is the 6th day, so it's a bit messy. Aunt Kai Huan glared at him. You set up these strange rules. Isn't it normal to take care of it every day? You were such a clean and well-behaved person when you were young. Why are you getting sloppy as you grow up? Chapter 55. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi could not say that this was the habit of a part-time worker in his previous life. He just walked behind Aunt Saihuan. Aunt Saihuan, don't move. I've learned a special massage technique. I guarantee that after you try it, your muscles and bones will stretch and your whole body will feel comfortable. Aunt Saihuan laughed. You child, you can learn anything, but you have to learn these useless things. Your mother and I are very healthy. Besides, there are so many maids and women. Do you think there is a shortage of people to massage your shoulders? You are the young master of Lu Province. Doing this kind of rough work will make people laugh at you. Lu Xiaoyi began. Massaging the shoulders of my elders, how is this rough work? Relax a little. Do you feel any difference this time? The people of this era, especially the noble ladies in the big houses, did not have any problems with their diet, but they did not have any habits of exercise. It did not matter when they were young, but when they were over 50, all kinds of problems were inevitable. No matter how good a machine was, at this age, it would start to have problems. It was best to do more exercise, but Lu Xiaoyi could not care about this. He could only see if his ability to be an idiot could be of some use. Other people had high goals and dreams, but he did not care. He cared about the people around him. Keeping accidents away from his circle was his greatest wish. The technique was still the original technique, and there was no improvement. It was the same technique he had enjoyed on certain occasions in his previous life. However, this time, he added a very subtle trace of spiritual power to the ordinary strength, and secretly observed Aunt Saihuan's body reaction. This was not a simple process of injecting spiritual power into the body. Instead, it was a process of opening up the meridians of the parallel qi technique bit by bit. This would be a long process. In his opinion, the parallel qi technique was worthy of its name. It was neutral and peaceful. It could make one's body feel like it had been reborn. Therefore, it would not be useless for older people. It was just that it would be much slower and would not accumulate in the dantian. It was not that he was reluctant, but if he did not know how to use it, the spiritual power in the body's dantian would only be a burden for ordinary people. What Lu Xiaoyi hoped to do was to lead the movement of the spiritual power in the meridians under his guidance. He did not seek to revive the youth of the elderly, but only to eliminate some possible hidden dangers. It was immoral for him to cultivate without caring about his family. It was a waste of filial piety. Everyone had a different understanding of filial piety. Some did it before death, while others did it after death. Lu Xiaoyi had his own understanding of the fusion of two souls. Aunt Saihuan closed her eyes and felt it. She only felt that Xiaoyi's massage this time was different from before. There was a tingling feeling, but it was still bearable. However, There was no specific change. As he enjoyed it, he asked, "Little E, it is indeed a little different this time. It seems to have the effect of acupuncture." Lu Shui struck while the iron was hot. "If Auntie Kai feels that something is wrong, just say it. Auntie Kai, how is Xiaoyi's technique? If you think that Lily is doing his best, why don't you tell me how busy you have been these days?" Auntie Kai Huan said coldly. "You little cunning girl, so you're deliberately trying to trick your Auntie Kai? Let me tell you, I can tell you everything, but not this. If you have the time to worry about this, you might as well think about how to pass the exam. Let your Auntie Kai make a wasted trip." Lu Xiaoyi chuckled. There was really no guarantee about this. He was not the original soul, so he had no confidence in this world because he did not understand the values of this world. Auntie Kai Huan said slowly, "Little E, after being in Pooh City for so many years, I know a few old teachers. They also have a lot of guesses about the questions for this summer's imperial examination. I heard that in the previous years they have also been pressured to pass a few times. Wait for me to ask for some questions in a few days. You can also try to do it. Just treat it as practice before the exam." Lu Xiaoyi laughed inwardly. Wasn't this the mock exam before the college entrance examination in his previous life? He had seen too many of them, and they were all just random guesses. How could they have really been pressured to pass? He did not care in his heart, but he said, "Okay, the questions Auntie Kai asks for must be 80 to 90% correct. Little you will go out and play today. There's no need to study. The summer's imperial examination depends on Auntie Kai." Auntie Kai Huan laughed and scolded. "You monkey, do you think I will let you go after you fail? Don't even think about it." Before lunch, Auntie Kai Huan left after giving a lot of instructions. She did not stay for lunch. Old people of her age could not eat together with young people. One side was light, and the other side was full of fish and meat. They were completely different styles. Lu Xiaoyi's appetite had increased greatly. It was 3 or 4 times the amount of food he used to eat, and he especially liked to eat blood. This was also a major characteristic of the qi eating stage. At his current level, he was still far from being able to truly abstain from eating qi. Moreover, his body was in the process of being continuously modified. This kind of subtle change would continue for a long time, and it was impossible for him to completely rely on spiritual vigor to provide energy. Instead, food accounted for most of his energy. This situation would continue until the end of the qi eating stage and the beginning of the induction process. Of course, those who were born in the cultivation system could use elixirs as a substitute. However, it was much more elegant than the individual cultivators who stuffed themselves with food. If he was in a gathering of cultivators, he could clearly distinguish who was a regular soldier and who was a bandit just by looking at the way they ate. There were less than 10 days left before the summer quarter examination, but the stock of white sandworms could only be used for 3 days. He did not have any plans to continue collecting worms in the near future. Time was too tight, and his mother was also keeping a close eye on him. There was no need to rush for this little bit of time. His daily cultivation had changed from absorbing the spiritual vigor of heaven and earth twice and using the white sandworms twice to absorbing the spiritual vigor of heaven and earth twice and using the white sandworms once. The time he saved was used on the cultivation of 2 spells, concealment and tornado escape. His cultivation was quite smooth. It was not because he was very talented, but because these 2 spells were easy to learn and effective. To put it bluntly, concealing one's tracks was also the channeling of qi. It was to do it as slowly and steadily as possible. When one's cultivation was profound, it would be difficult for others to detect that he was a cultivator if he moved his mind and qi without moving. The most difficult part of the tornado escape technique was the inscription of the 2 wings of wind formation. However, what Lu Xiaoyi's family did not lack the most was jade. Every year during festivals, he would be given jade as a gift. Formations were also not difficult for him. This was all thanks to the education he received from his previous life. Under this kind of education, he never lacked rational thinking. First, he found more than 10 pieces of bamboo, and used his spiritual energy to engrave the arrays on them. At the same time, he analyzed every notch, every turn, and every note in the array, and what they meant. In less than 3 days, he tied the bamboo pieces to his feet and used the channeling of qi to connect with the arrays on the bamboo pieces. It was integrated into the circulation of spiritual energy throughout his body. Instantly, he felt as light as a swallow. He could run like the wind and leap like an ape. He was not satisfied with such a small achievement. Since he had chosen such a common spell, of course, he had to maximize its power. Otherwise, what was the point of running as fast as other cultivators? If he wanted to run, he had to run as fast as he could. He did not do much research on arrays, but there was one thing he did know. He had no respect for fixed arrays. Since someone had created them, they could definitely improve on them. After fully understanding the core concept of this small wings of wind array, he began to add and subtract from it. The most important thing was to achieve a perfect balance between spiritual energy consumption, speed, and stability. This was not easy. But for a soul from his previous life, it was just adding a manual transmission. Lu Xiaoyi divided the tornado escape into 3 gears: low-speed concealment gear, medium-speed economic cruising gear, and high-speed explosive charging gear. This was enough for him to use. That's why I was thinking, could it be that Aunt Kaihong wants to marry a young miss from the Hu family for the young master? But after asking around, regardless of whether it's the main branch or the side branches, I've never heard of a girl of the right age to be married in the Hu family. I also don't understand. Young master's matter was not done properly, and Ping'an is willing to be punished. Lu Xiaoyi's mind raced. He found that his life was beginning to become rich and colorful. Who else knows about this? Ping'an swore. Other than me, no one else knows. What old Ma said when he drank too much, he didn't know about it afterwards. I only told young master about it. How could Ping'an dare to spread this kind of thing? I've served Lu province for more than 20 years. Ping'an still knows the rules. Lu Xiaoyi waved his hand. This matter ends here. Even if it's in front of mother, don't talk nonsense. She's old and can't be frightened. You did a good job this time. I've been very poor recently, so I can't reward you. But I'll definitely do what I promise you. You don't have to worry. Ping'an was relieved. Although he still didn't know what happened, young master's words were reliable. Moreover, this kind of thing involved the inner court, so he really couldn't get involved. After Ping'an left, Lu Xiaoyi fell into deep thought. Aunt Saihuan went out to have an affair. He wouldn't believe it even if he was beaten to death. This was the trust that had been cultivated from living together for nearly 20 years. Moreover, it was obvious that Tong Fu Opera House, a place with many eyes, was not the place to do this kind of thing. He thought of the words that Aunt Saihuan said to him a few days ago. She wanted to find him a few questions that the old master had hidden. At that time, he vaguely felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't tell what was wrong. Now he figured it out. The old master's hidden questions were an open and above-board matter. It was like this every year, and no one hid it. If it was right, it was a skill. If it was wrong, it was normal. There was no need to be afraid of anyone, and they wouldn't bear any responsibility. If it was right, the news would be spread widely and wantonly publicized. It was also a glorious thing. Therefore, in fact, the hidden questions would start 1 or 2 months before the summer examination. This point, it was impossible for the astute Aunt Saihuan not to know. Then, why didn't she bring these questions for Lu Xiaoyi to practice earlier? Why did she delay it until now, when it was close to the 5th or 6th day of the examination, and there was still no news? There was only one answer. That was not the old master's hidden questions openly, but through some channels to get the real questions. Only in this way could she really help her little husband. That was why it was delayed until now, because the questions were confirmed 3 days before the examination. The old master's hidden questions were just a cover to deceive Lu Xiaoyi. Aunt Saihuan didn't find a wife for him at all, because she knew her little husband's temperament the best. In order to satisfy his wishes, Aunt Saihuan put all her energy on how to help him pass the examination. It had to be said that Aunt Saihuan understood him better than his mother in a sense. She knew that he might not be confident, so she did this kind of private action. As the daughter of a general and born in a wealthy family, his mother would never do such a thing. Even if Lu Xiaoyi couldn't speak Chinese for the rest of his life, his mother wouldn't risk losing her reputation to buy exam questions. The only person who could do this was the fiercer and more fearless Aunt Saihuan. To her, as long as she could help Lu Xiaoyi, it didn't matter what she did. If others could buy it, why couldn't she, Lu Province, buy it? Lu Xiaoyi also wanted to cheat, and Aunt Saihuan also wanted to help him cheat. This wasn't a big deal, but the problem was, official whose selling of exam questions wasn't something that just anyone could get involved in. The person who pulled the strings was neither the housekeeper of the outer court nor the housekeeper of the inner court, but official whose personal attendant, Bing. There was only one reason why Lu Xiaoyi knew these secrets that even Li San Lang didn't want to talk about, and that was second sister Li. They had already met several times, and a woman who was in love didn't have a filter on her mouth. Not to mention the secrets of the Wu family, even the secrets of the Li family's old master were also open in front of her lover. There was nothing that she didn't dare to say. Official who had been working in Pu City for more than 10 years. He had amassed a lot of wealth and was still able to stand tall because he was reliable and watertight. There was a key person in this, and that was his personal attendant, Bing. The few times the Li family bought exam questions, it was through him, and not anyone else. It was impossible for anyone else to do so. They were all experienced officials. The more people involved, the easier it was to be exposed. This principle didn't need to be taught. How could a set of exam questions be given to 2 people to sell separately? This was a path to death. Chapter 57. The question was, where did this housekeeper of the Hu residence come from? Selling exam questions had nothing to do with him for more than 10 years. Why were there 2 people in the Hu residence doing the same thing this year? Was Master Hu so short of money that he went crazy? Lu Shi's first thought was that this was a trap. It was a trap for Aunt Kai Huan, and also a trap for Lu Province. Who was scheming behind the scenes? He did not know. On the surface, it was Lu Buping from the Hu residence, but it might not be the truth. Once the matter was exposed, Master Hu would not be able to explain it clearly even if he had 100 mouths. Putting aside who was the culprit, it was definitely not a poor scholar like Wu Shuang. He did not have the ability, even if his future father-in-law was involved. Lanyu County Magistrate was just a small county under Pu City. He could not extend his reach that far. The most important thing now was how to stop this possible conspiracy against Lu Province. What made him depressed was that he could not tell his mother about this matter. Because from a subjective point of view, he and Aunt Kai Huan both had the subjective desire to cheat. He could only solve it himself. Wasn't it just cheating? Why did it become so complicated? Would it be because of this matter that Li San's real disclosure was delayed? Lu Xiaoyi sighed. This cultivation had created a pile of troubles in the mortal world. Since he was in the situation, it was impossible to stay out of it. The only good news was that he knew the location of the handover, Tongfu Opera House. He also knew the specific time. It would be the 3rd day or the 2nd day before the exam. It would not be later. Time passed quietly. Lu Xiaoyi went out again to buy some things and investigate the terrain. He needed to be more careful. This time, it was different from the spring festival. He could not fail. In fact, he could just find a chance to talk to Aunt Kai Huan openly and not let her continue. However, doing so would not be clean. What if Lu Buping happened to get such an opportunity and wanted to make a fortune? If the business failed, he would blame Aunt Kai Huan for not keeping her promise. If he exposed this matter again, although there was no direct evidence, gossip was a fearful thing. It would not be good for Lu province. If Lu Buping was indeed digging a hole, then who was behind it? He had to be clear about this. He couldn't be so unclear. He might have dodged it this time, but what about the next time? Therefore, they needed to see the real deal. At the very least, he had to let this schemer know the attitude of Lu province. He felt a surge of emotions. This was the first time he was a hero in a busy city. Although he was a cultivator, and doing this was a bit of a bully, he did not have any psychological burden. After all, wasn't the purpose of learning skills just for this day? Wasn't it just to protect his family? Unfortunately, his current ability was still a little weak. He could not be as calm as a real cultivator who could wave his hand and disperse the dark clouds. Another 3 days passed. On this day, according to the usual practice, the questions had been stored in the database, and there were no more changes. Early in the morning, Lu Xiaoyi arrived at the courtyard of the storehouse where the miscellaneous items were stored. Old Sung, who was in charge of the storehouse, hurriedly greeted him. The little master was a rare guest here. This year, they wouldn't even see him once, so they had to serve him well. Lu Xiaoyi waved his hand. You go do your own thing. I'm here to look for some old toys. I don't need anyone to accompany me. This search took him half a day. Even his lunch was settled in the storehouse. Old Seng wanted to help, but he couldn't, because he didn't know what the little master was looking for. Seeing that it was the middle of the night, the clear voice of a little maid came from the stable, which was only a wall away from the storehouse. Old Ma, prepare the carriage. Aunt Kai Huan will use it in half an hour. This was the purpose Lu Xiaoyi wanted to achieve. Separated by a wall, ordinary people couldn't hear the voice on the other side. However, he was different. His perception was already that of a cultivator's. No matter how far he was, he couldn't do it. However, a wall couldn't stop him. It was very troublesome for a woman from a big family to travel. She had to prepare the carriage and the sedan, and she also had to dress up. This preparation was indispensable. It would not lose the identity of a big family. Therefore, Lu Xiaoyi could determine the time when Aunt Kai Huan would go out. He still had more than half an hour, so he could make it in time. After casually grabbing a few items from the storeroom, Lu Xiaoyi quickly returned to his study room and began to make the preparations that he had long thought of. Makeup was very troublesome for ordinary people, but there was actually a trick to it. It didn't need to be earth-shattering and unrecognizable. It only needed to be changed in a few special places. As long as people weren't particularly familiar with you, they would only pay attention to the characteristics of your face. They wouldn't observe you as a whole. For example, put on a mustache, put a plaster on your temples, and put on a big mole. After tidying up his face, he quickly took off all his clothes. He was naked, and then put on 3 robes, 1 white, 1 black, and 1 green. The weather was too hot, and the underwear was a little bloated. He hoped that there wouldn't be a third change of clothes. If that happened, he would have to run naked in Pooh City. The color of the clothes was also the focus of other people's memories. He pasted 2 pieces of jade that he had carved yesterday on his legs. This was the magic that he was most proficient in now. It could save his life in times of danger. He circulated the qi circulation formula, and his body emitted a slight explosive sound. He was already half a head shorter. If he went out like this, even his own mother would have to take a long time to recognize him. After everything was ready, he directly jumped from the study to the roof. The courtyard was quiet. Everyone knew that the little husband didn't like to be disturbed, so they were happy to take a nap in the house. No one was loitering in the courtyard. His courtyard was on the side of Lu Province. There was a remote alley behind 2 rows of houses. This was the wealthy district of Pooh City. There weren't any idle people, and there were no peddlers walking through the streets. This was all within his expectations. It was the result of his observation over the past few days. He quickly walked out of the alley. After crossing a street, there was a carriage shop that accepted goods and people. He found a carriage and jumped on it. "Morning Wind Brothel, hurry!" He threw down a piece of silver and didn't say anything else. This was what he had learned from watching spy movies in his previous life. This was the first time he used it, and he was quite good at it. He also knew that this might be superfluous, but he just wanted to be fresh. He had to do it perfectly. Throughout the whole process, he operated his concealment to the extreme. He didn't forget that there were other cultivators in this world. If he used some special methods to track them, it would be difficult for a rookie like him to hide. Therefore, the use of both cultivation methods and mortal means was to minimize the traces. If there was an impressive high-level cultivator in this city, they could only blame themselves for their bad luck. They couldn't do nothing just because there was such a possibility, right? There were still a few streets away from Morning Wind Brothel. Lu Xiaoyi took off his black robe in the carriage and stuck 2 strands of beard on it. Then, he gently lifted the carriage curtain and jumped out. By doing this, the coachman wouldn't know where he got off. He switched to another carriage, and this time, he went straight to Tongfu Opera House. When he got off the carriage at Tongfu, only an hour had passed. Aunt Kai Huan was dragging her feet, and there was still an hour's distance from him. He glanced at the carriages outside Tongfu Opera House. A carriage with the Hu Mansion symbol was among them. This was good news. He was most afraid that Lu Bumpy would come later than Aunt Sai Huan, which would cause a lot of trouble. Chapter 58. Lu Xiaoyi had always been curious. If this really was a trap for Lu Province, what would the opponent do? Exposure would be the most devastating blow to a family like Lu Province that relied on their reputation to make a living. Their reputation would be ruined, and in a few years, Lu Province would be torn apart by countless vicious wolves. So, in this world where there were no recordings or videos, what would they do? The only way was to catch them in the act. The transaction was likely to be completed in a very short period of time. No matter how stupid Aunt Kai Huan was, she wouldn't delay for too long in this kind of situation. Therefore, the key was how the government's forces could arrive in the shortest time possible. Obviously, there wasn't enough time to dispatch from the yamen. For this kind of thing, it was best to catch the thief with the stolen goods and seize it on the spot. In other words, it was very likely that the officials were already lying in ambush nearby. This was Lu Xiaoyi's judgment. There was still enough time, and he had the opportunity to verify it. From the bottom of his heart, he was still kind and didn't want to use guesses as a basis to solve problems. Near Tung Fuk Mansion, there were 2 alleys where people could hide and arrive quickly. There were too many shops in other places, and there was an endless stream of people coming and going. It wasn't a good place to gather. Lu Xiaoyi had already figured all of this out a few days ago. When he settled down to do things, he could still consider everything very comprehensively. For a rice worm who yearned for a comfortable life, anyone who dared to disturb his happy life would be his irreconcilable enemy. The first alleyway was normal. At least in Lu Xiaoyi's eyes, the beggars and peddlers were normal. After all, this wasn't a real spy battle. They were just catching a noble lady from Lu Province, not a famous bandit. The officials wouldn't go so far as to mobilize so many people and use all their skills. The second alleyway was a small gathering of several idlers. Although they were dressed like ordinary people, the fast boots on their feet revealed their true identities. He recognized one of them. It was the leader of the group who had gone to Lu Province to pass on the news last time. Lu Xiaoyi didn't directly go there. Instead, he used the same trick and entered a rice store from another street. Behind the rice store was the place where those people gathered. He still had 30 minutes to confirm the real purpose of these people. He relied on his extraordinary hearing. 15 minutes later, nothing happened behind the rice stall. Lu Xiaoyi was about to leave when a few whispers came from behind the wall. "Chairman, what are you doing? The reason is unknown, the target is unknown, and the time is uncertain." All we can do is wait foolishly. The weather is so hot. Why don't we find a place to drink some tea and rest for a while? There was no need to doubt him. Under the waiter's respectful gaze, Lu Xiaoyi arrived at Heaven Room A. He lightly knocked on the door frame and an old voice came from inside. Please come in. Lu Xiaoyi turned around and smiled at the waiter. He pushed the door open and entered. The waiter then went downstairs to greet the other guests. He thought that when he was free, he must send over a pot of fragrant tea. Who knows, the guests from Dafa might have a generous reward. Closing the door, an old man sitting behind the tea table looked puzzled. Clearly, he had no impression of this stranger. He frowned. Who are you? You and I don't know each other. Did you enter the wrong room? According to the normal plot, Lu Xiaoyi should have pulled a chair over and sat in front of the old man. He should have crossed his legs and stared at him with a mocking gaze. Then, he should have said some nonsense. It would have been best if he had a small object in his hand that he could toss and catch, or a lighter or something, to create mental pressure on the old man. But he also knew that he didn't know if this would create pressure, but this kind of distance would definitely create variables. This wasn't acting. If there was a mistake, the director wouldn't call for a retake. He took 2 steps forward and pressed down on the old man who was about to stand back down on the chair. One hand on the old man's shoulder, and the other hand on the old man's throat. This was the correct way to solve the problem. You and I really don't know each other, but I didn't find the wrong person. Lu Buping, you're the housekeeper of the Hu residence, right? The old man was fully aware of the danger at this time. Thinking about his purpose of coming here, he already had some guesses. But he had been through a lot, so he didn't panic or lose his composure. It's me, Lu Buping. But what is your purpose of coming here? Do you have a grudge? Or were you entrusted by someone? Gentlemen don't speak ill of each other, let alone fight. At my age, I can't take this kind of shock. This person wasn't easy to deal with. This was Lu Xiaoyi's first impression. Chapter 59. When a person is in a state of shock, there are many natural reactions. Cursing, struggling, resisting, begging for mercy, these are all signs of a psychological breakdown. If he works harder, he will be able to take out his treasures. But this old man, who pretended to be a fool with a purpose, only showed that he was clear-headed and knew what he was doing. He also knew what he was facing. It was very difficult to make such a person submit completely in a short period of time, and Lu Xiaoyi did not have much time. Why did he come here? Why didn't he just persuade Aunt Kai to stop? He wanted to solve this problem once and for all. Even if he could not solve it, he wanted to show the person behind this. He wanted to make sure he did not dare to do it again. Otherwise, why would he hide this time? What about next time? There was only 1,000 days of being a thief, but not 1,000 days of being on guard. This was what the young master of Lu Province had to do. Who ordered you to frame Lu Province? Tell me, and I will spare your life. Lu Xiaoyi went straight to the point. When the old man heard this, he sighed. The Lu residence was indeed the Lu residence. The Seymour residence was not to be trifled with. It had not been easy for him to gain the trust of that foolish woman. He was only one step away from success, but he did not expect that someone would interfere. There was no need to think, this person must be from the Lu residence, or was asked by the Lu residence to come. I don't understand what you are saying. If you don't let go, I will shout for help. He could only play dumb. Lu Xiaoyi smiled contemptuously. Then why don't you shout? You have lived for so long, so you must have seen a lot. I think you know that shouting at the scene of harm is the path to death. Since you don't know anything, why don't I search you and see what kind of outstanding documents the butler of the Hu residence has on him? The old man begged for mercy. Fine, since you know everything, I can't insist. But please give this old man some face and let this old man do it himself, okay? Lu Xiaoyi nodded. He did not have any experience in body searching. If it was a woman with a full body, he would not mind doing it himself. But this was an old man who was almost buried up to his neck. How could he be in the mood to search him? It would be best if he did it himself. Anyway, as an ordinary person, how could an old and frail person like him be a match for a young and strong cultivator with spiritual power? He was confident that he could stop Steward Lu before he made a move. Lu Buping shook his head and sighed. He slowly took out a small roll of silk brocade from his boot and handed it to Lu Xiaoyi. It did not seem to be fake. Lu Xiaoyi took the silk brocade and subconsciously opened it to check if it was real or fake. But he did not notice that Lu Buping's hand conveniently wiped his mouth. If one's eyesight was good, one would be rewarded endlessly. If one did not know what was good for them and went forward, a scolding would be light. It was normal to be slapped in the face. In this situation, he thought about it and gave up on the idea of going in to deliver the tea. If they did not see eye to eye, it meant that the discussion had broken down. If the discussion broke down, naturally the customer would be in a bad mood. If he sent this pot of tea up now, not only would he not get anything good, he would also be annoyed. When he looked downstairs again, the customer had already gone far away. Lu Xiaoyi walked on the main street. His speed was not fast. This street was the only way to come from the direction of Lu province. The carriages of large families would not easily enter those remote alleys. Firstly, it was very bumpy. Secondly, there were beggars and thieves harassing them. Therefore, they had to take the main street. Near a corner, behind a silk shop, Lu Xiaoyi flashed in. After 10 breaths, he came out again. He was already wearing the last green robe on his body. His mustache had also been pulled off by him. Walking along the main street, he felt something in his heart. Murder. It was the first time in both his lives. But what made him feel strange was that he did not feel any discomfort in his heart. He was dizzy with blood, but he was not dizzy with death. What made him surprised was that at the last moment, there was no hesitation in his decision. It was as if killing Lu Buping was the best solution. There was no other way. He did it, but he did not regret it. This person was very dangerous. For his own riceworm life, he could not be left alive. Leaving him alive would be the greatest irresponsibility to Lu province. He could also guess that Lu Buping was paving the way for his future. He wanted to give his descendants a bright future. The price was that Lu province would perish together with him. His hopes were pinned on the mastermind behind it. To Lu Buping, this was a very correct choice. Lu province only had reputation left. What actual power did it have? As for who the mastermind behind it was, this was not difficult to guess. It was the arrest office, the judicial department's Sir Song. How could it be a small figure if he could mobilize people on this line? This Lu Buping lying here was an answer. It was the attitude of Lu province. As for the so-called incomprehensible power that Lu Buping had threatened him with, it was referring to cultivators. Lu Xiaoyi understood this point very well. This was also the reason why he had been so careful throughout his entire operation. With his previous life's espionage and his cultivation in this life, if this was exposed, he would accept it. He could not just wait for death and not do anything, right? Chapter 60. Amidst the heavy traffic, the sun was particularly bright, dispersing the shadow left behind by his killing. He couldn't help but ask himself, I used to be a person who loved life so much. How did I become so unscrupulous about the lives of others? Was it a change in the process of crossing over? Or was it the madness under the surface of the original Lu Xiaoyi's gentle appearance? Or perhaps this was the real him, the true face of the poor loser who had accomplished nothing and acted as if he didn't care? Because of his cultivation, he felt that the laws of the world could no longer restrain him as a cultivator. No matter what, as long as he was happy and achieved his goal. In front of the carriage, the speed was steady and the sound of hooves was clear. In an inconspicuous position in front of the carriage, the word Lu could be clearly seen. Lu Xiaoyi naturally took something out of his sleeve and placed it on the side of the road. After estimating the distance, he took out a flint and lit it as if there was no one else around. This was the most popular fireworks in this world's festive season. Of course, there were no strict restrictions like in his previous life. It could be set off at any time and any place, but it was expensive and not something that poor people could afford. When the fireworks started, it immediately attracted the attention of everyone around. People subconsciously looked at the fireworks, not at the person who inexplicably lit the fireworks. The old horse's skill was superb. The fireworks in front of him did not cause any trouble to him. With a wave of his whip, the two horses had already passed the fireworks. He was still wondering in his heart, which family did this brat come from? If he encountered a novice driver and frightened the horse, it would be a big disaster. Because his mind was completely focused on the two horses in front of him, he strongly restrained them to prevent them from running around, so he did not feel that his carriage seemed to be heavier than before. He was the driver, not the horse, so of course he could not feel it. The carriages in this world were not made of a rigid structure. The frame was made of wood and the surroundings were covered with cloth curtains, including the curtains for the passengers. Therefore, Lu Xiaoyi could easily jump up. Immediately, he covered the mouth of the old woman in the carriage. For such a secret matter, there was no reason to bring a maid. There were too many people and too many mouths, so it was a very shallow consideration. Aunt Saihuan, it's me, Little E. I'm not a robber. Lu Xiaoyi had regained his voice, so the old woman quickly recognized him. She couldn't help but scold. You're a family member who has lived with you for 19 years. Little E? What are you doing? You look like this. Lu Xiaoyi said concisely. Auntie Kai, it's a long story. Let's make it short. Lu Buping had set up an ambush in Tongfu. Lu Xiaoyi said truthfully. Today and tomorrow, we still have to see how this matter ferments. Maybe it will have an impact, maybe it won't. It's hard to say. Auntie Kai Huan was a little regretful. Little E, Auntie has delayed you. Lu Xiaoyi was indifferent. Auntie Kai, I'll tell you the truth. It's just that I didn't buy the questions. Did I study for more than 10 years for nothing? I just wanted to add a layer of insurance. It's fine if I have it, but it's fine if I don't. This was a little boastful, but what could he do now? Some things outside of his body, he obviously didn't care about himself, but he still needed to fight for his loved ones, as long as they were happy. Auntie Kai Huan sighed again. Since you've already gone to Tongfu, have you seen Lu Buping? Auntie was a little rash this time and didn't think too much. Now that I think about it, if this person turned around and made a false accusation, would there be any problems? Lu Xiaoyi asked. Just based on this matter alone, did you come into contact with anyone else? Auntie Kai Huan was resolute. No. No matter how muddle-headed Auntie is, in this kind of big matter that could damage Lu Province's reputation, I wouldn't allow too many people to participate. There was only Lu Buping, and the others didn't even have servants. When we entered Tongfu Opera House, we all went alone. Lu Xiaoyi said softly. If that's the case, Auntie Kai can rest assured that Lu Buping will definitely not open his mouth to speak ill of Lu Province again. Auntie Kai Huan covered her mouth. Little EU. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. This matter couldn't be hidden. At this moment, Tongfu Opera House was already in an uproar, wasn't it? Since they're targeting our Lu Province, they need to pay a sufficient price. Otherwise, they won't be able to warn the future generations. Auntie Kai, let me ask you something. When father was the chief of staff, did he kill anyone? Auntie Kai Huan said. I've never seen anyone kill with their own hands, but there were many who used schemes to kill. The two of them fell silent. The higher up the ranks, the more complicated it was. A person with perfect morals could not reach the position of chief of staff. So, who dared to say that their hands were not stained with blood? Auntie Kai Huan was very emotional. In the end, he was still Chief Lu's bloodline. No matter how introverted and weak he used to be, as he grew up, the ruthlessness of the Lu family still showed itself. She wondered if the mistress would be happy if she knew about it. Or was she worried too much? Since young, he had been raised like a sparrow. Now, he looked a little like an eagle. In the future, would he still change? She now felt that little Yi's way of handling things was good. He should not continue. The current Lu province could not hold a troublemaker. But she couldn't say this, because it was her own carelessness that caused the trouble. Chapter 61. Little Yi, you've grown up. I don't know how to help you in the future. Lu Xiaoyi held her hand. You've always helped me, and you'll do the same in the future. The only difference is, please allow me to help you in the future. Aunt Kai, shouldn't we not tell Mother about this? If she finds out that we're both thinking about how to cheat, she won't let us off. Aunt Kai Huan smiled bitterly. I'm old. I actually formed an alliance with a little monkey like you. Don't you think I'm getting worse and worse? But only this time. If you don't behave in the future, I won't accommodate you just because we share a secret. At the door, Aunt Kai Huan looked back at him. Little Yi, I didn't find a wife for you this time because I firmly believe that you can pass the exam. But that's not a reason for you to indulge yourself. Can't you avoid some people when you go to the Li family's side courtyard? Lu Xiaoyi blushed with shame and bowed repeatedly. The news of his secret rendezvous with second sister Li had spread to Aunt Kai Huan. In fact, it wasn't his carelessness, but a little deliberate. Setting up a character needed to be managed. If he wanted to hide one aspect, he had to expose another. What better way to hide his nature as a cultivator than to have a reputation of being dissolute? That night, a table of dishes from Elegant Wind House was sent to Lu province. Someone had specially ordered it for the young master of the Lu family. Lu Xiaoyi closed the door and enjoyed it alone. Like his mother and Aunt Kai Huan, they basically didn't touch the dishes of restaurants outside, as they thought it was too greasy. There were a total of 8 dishes, but he didn't know where the answer was hidden, nor was there any hint. Every porcelain plate was labeled with the name of the dish. Otherwise, Lu Xiaoyi, who had never been to Elegant Wind House, probably wouldn't have been able to recognize half of it. Spring and autumn duck, jade tripe, smelling fish, bamboo tube meat, 8-color platter, blossoming fragrance fried, old tofu, teacher's biscuit, for meat and 4 vegetables. It was a very affordable meal, and it didn't seem luxurious. The Elegant Wind restaurant was a very special restaurant. To be honest, it was considered a mid-tier restaurant in Poo City. Its specialty was that every dish was named after a phrase from a historical book or an allusion. Therefore, this place was the favorite of scholars. It was more elegant. Even though it was named after a literary phrase, duck buttocks were still duck buttocks. The dishes were all served in porcelain, and it was impossible for this kind of information to leave evidence on porcelain. Therefore, it could only be in the 8 dishes. Can't you be a little more straightforward when playing this game with me? If he ate all 8 dishes, he would definitely gain something. However, this would not show Lu Xiaoyi's intelligence. After going through the names of the 8 dishes in his mind, he had a rough idea. He picked up the plate of Wendao fish, put his finger into the fish's mouth, and with a pinch, took out a tightly sealed oiled paper package. He thought to himself, Wendao, literary thief? Was Li San scolding me? He opened the oiled paper package. There was still a layer of oiled paper inside. It seemed that Li San was not stupid. He knew that if this thing was placed in the fish's stomach for a long time, it would be easily soaked. He opened it again, and there was still a layer of oiled paper inside. Lu Xiaoyi was a little angry. Was Li San deliberately making fun of him? He opened the last layer of oiled paper. It was empty. It was gone. Realizing that he had been made fun of, Lu Xiaoyi became interested. This was obviously Li San testing his intelligence. Did he not think about what would happen if he really could not guess? However, for him, it would be a little embarrassing if he really asked about it tomorrow. After carefully examining the surface of the table, he soon discovered that every plate was of a different standard. The characteristics of each plate were that they were all different. They were all grotesquely shaped and had flaws. Some of them were missing, and some of them were protruding. They were not caused by the fall, but were deliberately sintered. It was impossible for the elegant Wind restaurant to arrange such plates. It must be of a uniform standard to be convenient to carry around. Therefore, it went without saying that the dishes were most likely from the elegant Wind restaurant, but someone had changed the plates. Who was the one who did this? Other than that boring Li San, it seemed that no one would do such a meaningless thing. Lu Xiaoyi had a guess and began to assemble the plates. As expected, for every 2 plates, there would always be a perfect fit. For example, the spring-autumn duck and the 8-color platter would fit together perfectly, forming a large oval-shaped plate. So on and so forth. The bamboo meat would fit together perfectly, forming a large oval-shaped plate. So on and so forth. The bamboo meat would fit together with the fragrant fried flour, the jade tripe would fit together with the old tofu, the smelling fish would fit together with the teacher's biscuit. The summer examination of the Yi Kingdom had 4 questions. 2 questions about sutra, one about the meaning of sutra, and one about policy. The final result would be the basis of whether or not the scholar could pass the examination. When the spring-autumn duck and the 8-color platter were put together, it actually meant that the 7th chapter of the sutra, spring-autumn, was not the 8th chapter. Because one of the colors of the 8-color platter was eaten by Li San. Without a doubt, this was one of the sutra questions in this examination. It was like the fill-in-the-blank in his previous life, covering the 2 sentences before and after, leaving only the middle for the examinee to answer. Similarly, when the jadeite belly and the old family tofu were put together, it meant that the jadeite chapter of the sutra, Old Family Zhuang Zhu, was another sutra question. When the bamboo tube meat and the blossoming flower fragrance were put together, it was the meaning of the sutra essay, Bamboo Tube Blossoms. This was a very famous allusion of the Confucian school. When the Tao-smelling fish and the teacher's biscuit were put together, the meaning was clear. The one who heard the Tao first was the teacher. This was a question about policy. It couldn't be wrong. It had to be like this. Lu Xiaoyi solved the riddle, but he didn't feel excited. Instead, he deeply felt the awe-inspiring intelligence of the people in this world. A business family was able to make such a fraudulent act that could lead to the destruction of the family so seamlessly. Even if people knew that the Li family was leaking the questions, they couldn't find any concrete evidence. The dishes were all from the elegant Wind restaurant. They were naturally there. What could they do about what he ordered? If ordinary people were like this, then what about cultivators? It was a little chilling. Lu Xiaoyi regretted his action in the afternoon. It wasn't whether he should have done it or not, but he should have been more prepared. At the very least, he should have worn more robes and changed more often. Because he was afraid of the heat, he only wore 3 robes. There were many others. In the center of Pu City, there was a tall and lofty official housing area. At the back of a secluded place, a middle-aged man in casual clothes was resting with his eyes closed. He looked calm, but his fingers kept tapping on the armrest of the armchair, revealing the anxiety in his heart. Something had happened today, and it made him very uneasy. He needed an answer to whether he should continue or stop. Although his voice was almost the only voice in the city, there were still some mysterious existences in this world. You could belittle them in the name of righteousness, but the real high-ranking people knew very well what those mysterious existences represented. It was not easy to provoke them. Not only him, but also many big shots in the kingdom of the Shining Knight who were above him. Now, He had no choice but to rely on the help of that mysterious power. Otherwise, with the abilities of the group of good-for-nothings under him, he didn't know how much time it would take to figure out this matter. The most important thing was that there were some secrets that couldn't be known by the big mouths of the arrestor office. Rather than that, it was better not to investigate. Only those with mysterious powers had the ability to find out the truth in a very short time. The most reassuring thing was that they weren't interested in the intrigues of the mortal world. They just did things without asking for the reason. This was the real reason why he asked for their help. Chapter 62. In the center of Pooh City, there was a tall and majestic official housing area. In a secluded place at the back, a middle-aged man in casual clothes was resting with his eyes closed. He looked calm, but his fingers kept tapping on the armrest of the armrest, revealing the anxiety in his heart. Something had happened today that made him very uneasy. He needed an answer to whether he should continue or stop. Although his voice was almost the only voice in the city, there were still some mysterious existences in this world. One could belittle them in the name of righteousness, but the real high-ranking people knew very well what those mysterious existences represented. They were not to be trifled with. Not only him, but also many important people in the Sunshine Kingdom who were above him. Now, he had no choice but to rely on the help of that mysterious power. Otherwise, with the abilities of the group of trash under him, who knew how long it would take for them to find out the truth. Most importantly, there were some secrets that could not be revealed to the big mouths of the arresting officers. Rather than that, it was better not to investigate. Only those with mysterious abilities had the ability to obtain the truth in a very short period of time. The most reassuring thing was that they were not interested in the infighting of the mortal world. They only cared about doing things and did not ask for reasons. This was the real reason why he had sought their help. His eagerness did not receive the fastest response. Nearly 12 hours had passed since the incident, and it was already late at night. Even the brothel had stopped, but he was still waiting. Until now, it was his habit to eliminate uncertainties. Without an answer, he could not sleep. This was because he knew that for those with mysterious powers, the night was not an obstacle. His waiting did not disappoint him. When he was about to pour himself the 7th cup of strong tea, there seemed to be a gust of wind outside the door, bringing with it the sound of falling leaves. The light in front of him flickered, and a person covered in a black robe stood in front of him. He did not put on airs and stood up as well. People from different worlds could not be compared by status and wealth. He felt that he was superior, but the other person felt that he was not worth mentioning. "Youngsher, how is it? Did you investigate clearly?" "Yes, I did." "I did not investigate clearly. This matter is very strange. I advise you not to investigate further." Youngsher's reply was not very respectful, as if he was not aware of the other party's status in Pooh City. Of course, he knew, but he did not care. The middle-aged man was infuriated. If any of his subordinates dared to speak to him like this, he would have to go to the streets to catch thieves the next day. However, the person in front of him was not within his control. "What do you mean?" Youngsher was very calm and did not care about the dissatisfaction in his tone. "I found it. It means that this person is a cultivator. The reason I couldn't find anything was because I couldn't determine who this cultivator was. Did he cultivate in Pooh City? Or are you just passing by?" The middle-aged man tried his best to suppress his anger. "Don't you know how many cultivators there are in Pooh City? Can I ask them all once? It's not like it's too troublesome." Youngsher said with disdain. "Sir, our world is different from yours. You rely on the power of the system, the so-called status, while we rely on the pure strength of individuals. You have a hierarchy, but in the cultivation circle at the level of Pooh City, everyone is equal. I don't have the authority to ask about their actions, and they will not easily tell me their movements. This is the rule of cultivators. It's not worth it for a trivial matter in the mortal world. The middle-aged man took a deep breath. All right, even if we don't ask your cultivation companions, can't we come to a conclusion from the scene of the murder? Yong-shur also softened his tone. After all, he was an official, so it was not good to be too blunt. He explained. This person is extremely careful. The killing method he uses is also a mortal method. It's very strange as he kills without spilling blood. In my circle, I have never heard of anyone with such a habit. From the way he came, it was impossible to trace him because he changed carriages at least once. From the way he returned, it was also impossible to identify him because not only did he change carriages, he also changed his clothes, voice, and appearance. If it wasn't because he was rewarding a piece of silver that the waiter casually broke, I wouldn't even know that he was a cultivator. I can only say that this person definitely came with a purpose. His mission was clear and his target was clear. He did not hesitate in his actions. Therefore, I believe that if you want to find the murderer, the secret in your heart can actually help you. From a technical point of view, I can't do it. No one in the entire Poo City's cultivation circle can do it. That person is really too careful. Yong-shur's words were hinting that this was the dirty internal strife of the officialdom. Everyone knew the secrets in their hearts, so why did they have to put cultivators in a difficult position? No one was stupid. If it was a simple murder, as a cultivator, it was only right to help apprehend the murderer, and it would be a merit. However, since there were cultivators involved, it was a different matter. The battle between cultivators was extremely dangerous. Failure meant that decades of cultivation would be lost in a day. Therefore, there had to be sufficient reasons. How could it be possible to expect cultivators to work hard for the ugliness of the mortal officialdom? Yong-shur had been investigating since the afternoon. At first, he put in a lot of effort. He was cultivating in Poo City and had the obligation to clean up this city's malignant tumor. Therefore, he cooperated with the constables and had a preliminary impression of the murderer's general movements. However, all the traces mysteriously disappeared after leaving Tong Fu. He could not help but admire the meticulousness of the murderer. It was not until he had an idea and took the silver piece that the murderer had rewarded him that he immediately felt an extremely subtle fluctuation of spiritual power on it. In another 2 hours, it would probably disappear completely. Only then did he realize that the murderer was actually a cultivator of the same profession. He immediately gave up the investigation because it did not conform to the principles of cultivation. Mortal officials valued motive, but cultivators needed to look deeper. What was the murderer's cultivation level? Was there any power behind him? Did this killing have anything to do with cultivation? If he foolishly interfered without figuring out these things, he would not even know how he lost his life. He had returned long ago, but he could not resist the urging of the officials. Otherwise, he would not have bothered to make this trip tonight. He had said everything that needed to be said. If it was not for the fact that he had been taken care of by the officials in Poo City all these years, he would not have bothered to say such nonsense. Why do you care so much about this murder case? If you don't tell me, I won't ask. But you know very well why the victim died. You also know which party did it. You asked me to come here because you want to borrow the power of cultivation to solve your troubles. If the opponent was just an ordinary mortal, I would accept this muddled account, but if it's a cultivator, I won't accept it. In Poo City, no cultivator would risk their life and safety with another cultivator's for such a trivial matter in the mortal world. It's not worth it. Yong-shur turned around and left. At the door, he turned back. For us cultivators, the thing that affects our cultivation path the most is making a choice. It's the same for you. Is the death of a chess piece worth such a big fuss from you? Also, pay attention to your own safety. If he can kill a butler, he can definitely kill you. In our eyes, you and that butler are actually of no different value. Yong-shur disappeared without a trace, leaving the middle-aged man standing there. His face alternated between red and white. This thing's words were too hurtful. Did it really think that the kingdom did not have the power to keep them in check? It was just that he could not mobilize it. However, there was one thing that this thing was right about. When it came to the inside story, no one knew it better than him. He had originally thought that after nearly 20 years of settling down, Lu Province's glory had faded, and its connections had faded with time. It was like a paper tiger, strong in appearance but weak in reality. It was precisely because of this that he, who had always been cautious, was prepared to make an example out of this once famous Sima manor. It was not that he was looking for trouble, but that there were big shots in the imperial court who were still brooding over the humiliation they had suffered from Sima Lu in the imperial court 20 years ago. Now that Sima Lu was no longer around, it was only natural for the son to repay the father's debt. As for him, he still wanted to go further. At the very least, he wanted to move to a prosperous place, and not spend his last years in this ordinary and unremarkable place. He did not have a strong backer in the imperial court, so he could only rely on himself to earn everything. If he did not show his allegiance, how could others pave the way for his advancement? Chapter 63. The middle-aged man shook his head and sighed. This world was like a big net, and no one could navigate it with ease. Even if he was the head of a government, it would be difficult for him to move forward when something really happened. He could only temporarily put aside the matter of Lu Province. No matter how unwilling he was, it was because tomorrow was the day that the governor would observe the arrival of official Zhao. In terms of rank, there was no difference between him and official Zhao. He was a local official, and official Zhao was a state governor. They were not subordinate to each other. However, after Xiao Lianji passed the exam, the governor was the main official, and even he had to retreat. The matters of the officialdom were very troublesome and involved too many things. How could it be so easy to distinguish clearly? In Lu Province, Aunt Saihuan had been nervous for the past 2 days. She was afraid that soldiers would break through the door, so she secretly made arrangements. She ordered 7 or 8 old soldiers to be ready at all times. Horses were on the saddle, swords and spears were at their sides. If something happened, they would immediately protect the mistress and the young master. At the same time, she used all her connections in Pu City's officialdom to grasp the movements of the officials at all times. She worked very hard because the mistress wanted to hide it, and her little husband did not care. However, who asked her to cause the trouble? She could only secretly hope that this crisis in Lu Province could be safely passed, and that everyone would live in peace. Lu Shui was busy in his study. He was not worried about Tongfu's case at all. Now, what was in front of him was to properly organize the questions sent by Li San. The 2 questions, the 7th chapter of the Spring and Autumn volume and the Jadeite chapter of the Old Zhuangzhu, he had read them before. However, being familiar with them did not mean that he could recite them backwards. Back then, because the original body hated exams, the direction of reading was more towards hobbies and not just for exams. Now, he needed to memorize the entire 2 chapters. Fortunately, after he had been transformed by the spiritual vigor, not only had his physical fitness improved, but his memory and mental strength had also improved. This made the originally difficult task of memorizing the 2 chapters much easier. He hoped that Li San's questions were reliable, and that the higher-ups would not change the questions because of Tongfu's leak. In his opinion, the possibility of change was not big because the officialdom had its own way of doing things. Since the silk scroll with the real questions had been swallowed by Lu Buping, then there was no evidence. If they could not frame Lu Province, then no one would be willing to reveal the truth and cause trouble for themselves. Keeping the lid shut was a secret to deal with this kind of situation. In these 2 days, the real trouble was that he had to write 2 articles, the bamboo tube blossoming bamboo tube, and the political inquiry article Hearing the Tao. It was impossible for him to write it himself. It was impossible for him to write it himself. It was impossible for him to do it in his entire life. Thus, he flipped through all the articles that the original body had written and chose a topic that was similar to the original body's. Actually, this kind of examination was similar to the imperial examinations in the ancient times of his previous world. It didn't make much of a difference whether it was 2 days more or 2 days less. There was no spirituality, no suitable entry point, and no ideological development. Even if you were given a year's time, a mediocre person wouldn't be able to write an unparalleled article. At the very least, Lu Xiaoyi's talent in this area was very limited. The original him was very ordinary, and the current him was even more ordinary. The only advantage was that he could write notes and flip through all kinds of literature. Unfortunately, the time was too tight. He couldn't find a gunman, and it was very difficult to find a reliable gunman. Piecing things together was his countermeasure. After 2 days, he finally came up with 2 articles that could be considered passable. This was already the limit of this body. In his opinion, if he combined the 4 questions, he could get full marks in the 2 questions about the scriptures, and the 2 articles would probably get above average. Considering that this was the summer imperial examination, there were many people who were admitted, and the standard requirements were not strict. Then, in fact, passing was not difficult. 2 days later, under the care of Ping'an and a group of attendants, Lu Xiaoyi embarked on the journey of the imperial examinations before dawn. In a quasi-cultivation world, he was still doing this. He really didn't know whether to laugh or cry. At the end of the 7 o'clock, all the examinees were in position. The examination questions were distributed. Lu Xiaoyi opened them and looked. He was half worried and half happy. Of the 4 answers sent by Li San, 3 were correct and 1 was wrong. The 2 questions about the sutra were correct, and the question about the blossoming bamboo tube was also correct. The wrong question was the policy question, not the question about the order of hearing the Tao, but the army of the Yamen, the important weapon of the country, should be the private weapon of the gentry? It was obvious that it was not Li San's mistake, but that someone changed the question. It was targeted at the incident of the Pu's city sending troops to rescue the 7 heroes. The cause and effect were also very clear. The group of poor scholar friends of Wushuang submitted a joint petition. After Minister Zhao saw it, he came to Pu's city and made a fuss about it. There was no obvious bias, but there was definitely some dissatisfaction. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. It was not easy to be a rice worm. There was a special study room for the examination. The rows of rooms could accommodate hundreds of examinees. Among the local academies in the entire Yi Kingdom, the Pu's City Academy was far from being large. The population was limited, and so was the economic strength. This was the result. But no matter how simple and crude the study room was, the place where the invigilator sat on the high platform in the center was very comfortable. 3 armchairs were placed side by side. On the left sat Lord Qin, on the right sat Lord Hu, and in the middle sat Lord Zhao, the Minister of Political Affairs. During the examination, this was the examination room. After the examination, this was the place where the examination papers were graded. In short, before the results were out, these invigilators were not allowed to leave the academy to ensure fairness. This was the rule of the Yi Kingdom. The examination had ended a few days ago. More than 20 teachers were nervously reviewing hundreds of examination papers. The workload was actually not small. The examinees often complained about the difficult conditions in the study room. In fact, for these officials and teachers, it was not much better. They had to persist for a longer time here. At their age, they could not hold on for more than 10 days without some physical strength. An old man came over with a silk roll in his hands. He looked tired. "My 3 lords, the list of the top 50 scholars is here. My lords, please check it." First, it was Minister Hu, then Minister Qin, and finally Minister Zhao. In fact, for people at their level, no one would cheat for personal gain in this kind of basic imperial examination. How could these big shots pay attention to those incompetent people who could not even pass the Wenjuan? The higher they went, the more they entered the officialdom. That was where they competed. For example, Wenjuan, Wenjuan, Wenjuan. Now they were just a group of primary school students who were fooling around. There was no value for them to fight. Under normal circumstances, it was still considered fair when the names were covered, unless there was a senior official who specifically targeted them. This time, the examination questions were changed. The examination questions were originally jointly drafted by Lord Cheen and the Minister of Education. The patrolling Minister of Education also inserted a stick. Therefore, there was a change in the last question of the policy theory. This was not new. In the most basic examination, such changes were allowed. Minister Zhao only changed one question. Some tough Minister of Education suspected that the local authorities were cheating, and some even changed all 4 questions. Both Minister Hu and Minister Qin had signed on the famous policy. They had also read some of the examination papers. Most of them were within the standard. Of course, it was impossible for them to read all of them. They did not have the time. Only Minister Zhao frowned after reading the famous policy. Where is the examination paper of the son of Lu Sima from the previous dynasty? You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.